Choi Han was standing in behind of the house. He turned his head and said, "We'll be fine from here." Dragon and Kale become visible and Cake stand in the earth. Kale looked at the dragon and the black dragon is more skilled at magic than I thought. Does it have to do with his character? I did say he's a bit better than the highest class wizard. This just shows that adult dragons really are capable of wiping out an entire kingdom if they decide to risk it all. But if I could get my hands on these Sound of the Wind, then I would not need to do this, nor would I need to bring these two along everywhere I go. The Sound of the Wind, that's the third ancient power that I am trying to obtain. To get that power, I need to visit Lady Amir's land at the northeastern coast of Rowoon. I plan to obtain the Sound of the Wind on my way back from the capital. It's a bit concerning that the ancient power is along the coastlines, but I can get it quietly. Since the whale tribe and mermaids only appear in the northern east coast toward the end of the fourth book, I can just say that I want to tour the kingdom a bit before I go back, then go over to the coast and take the power. I am sure Choi Han and his party won't be around me by then. Kale said to them, "Follow me." He was holding a fold paper. They were walking in the street where a lady and a man was talking. Choi Han said, "Night time in the capital is brighter than anywhere else." Kale replied, "It really is." They were walking in the market. Choi Han saw a couple was loving their child. Kale said, "Dragon, block out our sounds." A shield was formed around them so no one can hear them. Cake said, "There's a magic bomb here." Choi Han asked confusingly, "A bomb?" Cake replied, "Yes, a bomb." A magic bomb comes in many forms. The Western continent has been at war for a long time and there are many bombs since the continent excelled in the war of magic. But there are restrictions on things such as the place it can be installed or the acquisition of mana needed to denote it. Magic pumps are very hard to use. Matter newly developed magic bomb will explode, both here and all around the plaza in 6 days. Kale thought, 300 and underline found 5 bombs in the birth of hero, but since the story was altered I don't think these same people or places would hold the bombs. That means this situation could also take a turn for the worse at any time. Although, I have no doubt that the terrorist attack will carry on as planned. After all, we have confirmed that the Mad Wizard is here in the kingdom. Choi Han asked, "Are you saying that a bomb will go off here?" And looked at the family. Kale said, "That's right, it can be buried in any place or even be put on a person. Obviously, the person carrying it won't know it's a bomb, that's why we need to stop it." He looked. Mother picked up her child. They looked very happy. Choi Han asked, "So how do we stop it?" Kale replied, "It's simple. Magic bombs are basically lumps of mana, so you can use your mana sense to check for places that have her high mana density." He asked again, "Are the bombs high enough in density to be detected so easily?" Call replied, No, the mana will be so subtle that even wizards won't be able to sense it easily. Also, that tiny lump of mana can attract the mana around it in an instant to create a huge explosion." Choi Han looked him confusingly and said, "Lord Kale, it sounds tough." Cake replied, "It's easy," and looked at Dragon and asked, "Right?" Dragon said, "I can do it, it's just a bit annoying." Kale thought, "Right now, I have the Black Dragon, which has great magic skill and the best manner sense in this world, so finding those bombs will be a piece of cake." Kale gave Choi Han paper and said, "I don't know who will carry the bombs, but the bombs that will be buried will be put in place at least 2 days before the event. At least one bomb will be buried near this plaza." Choi Han said, "Yes sir," I agreed. Kale said, "Choi Han, take the dragon with you and search around the plaza for bombs every night." Choi Han asked confusingly, "Just the 2 of us?" Kale replied, "That's right, I am sure you can hide your presence and find the bombs without being noticed, you are very skilled." 3 Honor asked, "What do we do once we find the bombs?" He replied, "Just leave them be for the time being." He asked again, "Don't we have to remove them?" He replied, "We are going to remove them on the day of the event." 3 Hun asked confusingly, "Can I ask why?" Carl asked him instead of answering, "You want to find that wizard, don't you?" Magic bombs always need a visit to denote them. The one that made the bombs has to denote it using a central control device. Choi Han looked him confusingly. "Say it again, find the bombs first. If you can track the people who place the bombs, that will be even better." Kale thought, "I don't expect these 2 to find the perpetrator that easily, and since they are going to have to search every nook and cranny for any slightly dense mana lump, it's going to be quite a hassle. That's why I made the 2 of them do it. I can't help them here anyway and I don't want to help." Choi Han opened the paper and looked at. Choi Han asked, "Then, do we stop 2 days before the event?" Kale replied, no, you're going to have to sneak in on the day before, too. Choi Han was confused about his decisions and asked, the day before? And thought, the security will be a lot tighter on that day. Kale smiled and take out a ball. Cake said, I am sure it will only work for about 10 minutes because there will be many wizards, but this sound still help a lot. Anything related to magic will be used as to during that time. 10 minutes is all we need. And looked at the ball with bright smile. Cake was standing with the support of the wall and holding the ball. Choi Han was standing near to him and thought, then minutes is all we need. This marble will interrupt the bomb's mana for then minutes. We can use that time to save the people who are holding the bombs. I'm sure they'll be easy to find, and once that times comes, I'll have Choi Han and Dragon and many people and races to take advantage of. Kale stand straight and raise the ball. Choi Han looked him confusingly and said, Lord Kale, are you going to do all by yourself? He replied, so, get to work. Kale point a place and said again, I'll be waiting right over there, be black by 11 p.m. tonight. Choi Han turned his head and thought, why isn't he coming with us? Kale said, it's a bit chilly. Choi Han replied, yes it is, we'll work hard, so please buy me a drink when I return. Cake replied, all right. He looked at the dragon and told him, you should get going, too, dragon. Choi Han walked forward, he turned his head back and saw Kale, and then started moving. Dragon was flying with him. Kale looked at them from behind. 2 days later, at Kale house, Cake wake up and yawn. He thought, for 2 days, they searched all the places that might have bombs but they weren't able to find any yet. Servant knocked the door and asked, young master, are you up? Kale rise from bed. Servant opened the door and come in. Kale looked him shockingly and said, Ron. Ron stand in front of him. He replied, I'm back, my lord. Kale thought, I was woken up from my midsummer night's dream when reality came back to slap me in my face. Ron held the envelope in front of him and said, you've received a mail. Cake opened the envelope and smiled. The mail was, sir, will I be getting that free drink soon? Kale told said, gift wrap one of our finest wines. Kale sit in the couch and out the envelope in table and thought, Billos, the Flynn caravan's bastard, is coming to the capital soon. That means, I don't have much time to meet the crown prince in the palace. Ron standing near to him, bowed his head and asked, my lord, you remember that you have to go to the royal palace the day after tomorrow, don't you? Kale looked him and thought, right before the king gives tea celebratory speech which makes the beginning of the festival in the plaza, the young nobles are scheduled to meet with the crown prince. It's neither a banquet nor a supper but something in between. I heard they are going to use an entire palace for the banquet. I wonder if Taylor and KJ are doing well. The abundant eldest son and the crazy priestess, I am sure those two will do all right on their own. He thought formlessly, why am I even thinking about them? I should stop. I am going to stay put at the royal palace. I won't care what anyone says. I am just going to sit there. Ron said, my lord, may I follow you to the palace as your attendant? Kale said, who else would come with me if not you? Ron thought, darkness, the group that dominated the underworld of the eastern continent, have started to make their way over to the western continent. Darkness is one of their many names, and no one knows their true identity. The Malrans were one of the 5 assassin families that tried to control the night of the eastern continent. I am its heir. Ron Morlan despised darkness while also being terrified of them. I stayed here for a long time while I hid from them. It seems it's time that I leave. Kale looked at him and said, of course you're going to go, don't ask me something so obvious. Ron said with smile, you'll look great in the royal palace. Cake said with proud, Ron, to be honest, I really am handsome and have good body, don't I? He replied, of course, you have everything, my lord. Kale thought confusingly, what did I just hear? Ron bent down his head and said, I'll to out for a bit, I need to report to Vice Butler Hans. Kale looked him and thought, was his vacation too good? Why's he acting like that? Ron stepped towards the door and said with smile, I'll also tell the maids to prepare one of our best wines. Kale replied, okay, get going then. Ron opened the door and went out while On and Hong comes in. They sit in front of the Kale and Hong said, I think we can kill it when its guard is down. Hong said, we find a way. Kale looked at them and replied, good job. They happily clung his feet. Door was knocked. They both shouted, it's the wolf. Lark was standing outside the door. Cake gave the permission. Lark opened the door and come in. Kale set him to sit. Lark was shocked by his behavior and said, yes. He sit in front of him. Kale said, if you have anything to say, say it. Lark looked him confusingly. Kale said again, you look like you came here because you have something to say me, now's your chance to say it. Kale and Lark were sitting in the Kale room. Kale said, you look like you came here because you have something to say me, now it's your chance to say it. Lark stand up, put his hands on table and said thank you. Kale looked at him and thought, he seems foolish, cowardly, and even stupid at times. That's exactly how Lark was portrayed in the novel. In the novel, his personality changes after his first berserk mode, but he seems the same as before. Kale said, yes, you should be thankful. Lark said confusingly, sorry. And Sid again and said, yes. Kale said, you don't have to thank me anymore, you may go. Lark looked him and said, well, Lord Kale. He was so confused and stuttered his hands. Kale said, spit it out. Lark said shockingly, what? That's it. Kale said with smile, you have to look people straight in the eyes when you talk to them and spit out everything you want to say, I am all ears. Lark looked him confusingly and said sadly, I'm the big brother, I have to take care of my younger siblings. Also, I was a nephew in our younger brother, so I must get my revenge. He had the anger emotions, Kale thought, Lark younger siblings whom he must take care of, the blue wolf tribe that took care of the scaredy cat, his family, friends and neighbors will never be forgotten by Lark, so he has a debate to pay back. Lark continuously clench and tremble his hands. Kale said, a wolf, you're a wolf. Lark rise his head and look Kale shockingly. Kale said, I heard that was protect their families and prioritize family above all else, I think you are from a proud race. Tea was served in front of them in the table. Lark said happily, thank you for that also please help me. Own and Hong were sitting near Lark chair. Kale said, thanking me once is enough and I don't want to help you and thought, I am having a hard time as it is worrying about how to act like a lot because of Choi Han and the dragon alone is enough trouble, but Choi Han will drag alone more trouble in the future, that's why I cannot just rush to help him. I know how the 10 wolf children must be feeling, after losing their parents and homes. I have been there, although I am not a complete outside in this matter, I don't want to take on all the responsibilities. Kale stand duo and come near to him, but I'm willing to make a deal with you. He asked, a deal? Kale leaned and put on his hand on his table and one on his back and said, that's right, so what do you need help with? And what can you do for me? Lark was looking him confusingly. Kale said, come back when everything has been made clear. Lark looked at him and slide the chair and stand up. Lark said, yes sir, I'll come back when everything has been decided. Kale ruffled his hair and said with smile, good. The front of the Palace of Exaltation, a palanquin was stopped and Kale come out from the palanquin. He stand in front of the palace and thought, Palace of Exaltation, it's the name of the palace where banquets are held, it's a small palace that the Grand King had built to celebrate the Crown Prince's birth. Although, he favors the third prince now, it is incomparably bigger and more extravagant than the Hennidas Castle or the mansion at the capital. Have Eric, Amir and Gilbert not arrived yet? Another palanquin arrived and stopped. Kale looked at the palanquin and said angrily, darn it, is this cliché too? Why did it have to be now? In front of the palace, someone came out of the palanquin and walked towards him and said look who it is, it's the infamous Lord Kale. It was a man in green shirt and have brown hairs and wearing a earring in one ear. He asked again, are you here by yourself? Kale looked at his smiling face angrily and thought that I had to meet Vinyan's minion. Neo tolls, he's a shabby mad stereotypical villain, he's a volunteer of minion of Marquis Sten's second son and heir, Vinyan. The village that Black Dragon was kept in belonged to Viscount Tolls and the people of Tolls hated the people of Hennidas. The lands are just one mountain apart but the difference in wealth was too big, but they did try to be friendly with the counts in the past. 5 years ago, they aligned themselves with the Stens and become as cocky as they are now. Neo asked Kale, are you here by yourself? And smile. Kale thought with boredom, why did I have to meet Vinyan's minion at this moment? Kale and Neo was standing in front of each other. Ron was standing with a guard aside from them. A servant was standing near to Vinyan. Neo raised his hand and said to him, I am going to chat with Lord Kale for a moment, you guys should also go get your permits. He replied, yes sir. He said to Kale, Lord Kale, what is a lowly lout like you doing in a place like this? Kale thought angrily, how childish, is it because this world is a fantasy land in a novel or are there these types of people in the real world, too? I guess he's picking a fight with me since he's real. A young noble from a viscount's family talking like that to another young noble from a count's family? I thought that was only possible in books, but it's make me mad to experience it for myself. Cannot I do without these clichés since I am not even the protagonist? These petty villains who don't even know their places, I could ask Ron to take them out and that would be the end of it. Kale raised his head and looked at him. Neo made his fun and asked, "What is it? Do you want to throw a wine bottle at me? Or are you going to hit me?" Dragon, who was invisible to them, said to Kale, "He's rude." Kale looked at him and thought, he's picking a fight on purpose, since it's illegal to bring magic items inside the palace. He's still going at it as I cannot have any magic recording devices on me. Dragon said, "He reminds me of the bastard Vinian." Kale replied, "He's Vinian minion." Dragon asked, "Should I kill him?" Kale shook his hand in no and said, "I don't think you need to." Another palanquin stopped in front of the palace. Vinian turned his head and looked at palanquin confusingly. Kale also looked at the palanquin. Door opened and Eric, Amir and Gilbert comes out. Kale said Eric. Kale point on the Neo and said by expression, "Get rid of it." Eric gave the signal like he received his message and coughed slowly. Eric said with big smile, "Lord Neo, Kia being a long time." Kale thought angrily, "Crazy bastard." Vinian looked at them and thought angrily, "I guess they are trying to cover him even though he's loud just because they are on the same side." But suddenly his face expressions change, he looked confused and he looked at the Kale. He saw a big man behind the Kale, his expressions change into shock. Kale turned and entered in the palace and started walking. Dragon was flying behind him and said, "I recorded all the sound with my magic." Kale smirked and thought, "I will be sure to make him pay with that." I guess he left his guard down because he thought I would not have a magic recording device. Black Dragon Flex, Amir and Gilbert was standing behind the Eric and Eric was standing in front of the Neo. Eric said, "Lord Neo, we'll see you in the banquet hall later." Mad turned his head and said, "Lady Amir, Lord Gilbert, let us go." On the entrance, a servant said loudly, entering Lord Kale Henitus, of the Count Henitus family. Kale entered in the banquet and said, "This is nice." Amir comes near to him and said, "Lord Kale, in the banquet hall, the crown prince will sit on the highest seat and below that, tables are grouped according to each region. I don't need to explain why that is, do it?" Kale turned his head and looked at her and replied, "Thank you, but I'm already aware, my lady." She looked him confusingly. Kale looked around and saw the management of the hall and thought, there are a total of 5 tables in the banquet hall, northeast, northwest, southwest, southeast, and central. The tables are divided according to the spread of the nobles' powers. The crown prince is good at these things. He makes the nobles compete with one another, but he also makes them mingle. It's one of his main, said Trent, but he also takes great care of himself. The second and the third prince are cited a step lower than the crown prince. He puts so much care into all these little details. The crown prince and the people in high places are indeed really not my type. Eric stand near to him and said, "I knew our table would be the closest to the entrance." Kale put his hand on Eric's shoulder and replied, "I like that it's closer to the door, at least we don't have to find anyone to bow down to in our seats." Eric was touched by his words. Mad said, "Lord Kale, I'm glad that my efforts paid off." Kale looked him confusingly and thought, "Efforts? What efforts? I guess he's not talking casually because we are at the banquet. Why is she acting like that?" Amir and Gilbert was smiling. Servant again said loudly, entering Lord Vinian Sten, of the Marquis Sten family, and Vinian entered in the banquet behind him. Neo was also coming. Kale turned his head and saw them. Kale and the other 3 sit on their table. Vinian said, "Lord Kale is here." "Hello Lord Kale." Kale replied, "Yes, nice to meet you." Kale put his hand on his leg and thought, "I knew it." Dragon was sitting on his legs and looking him. Dragon was sitting on the Kale legs and looked not happy. Kale said it's alright, but Dragon was trembling. Kale said again, "I said it's alright." Dragon said, "I'm a great dragon." Before they come here, Kale explained the dragon about the situation. Dragon was sitting in the wall of the terrace and Kale was standing in the door. Kale said, "Listen up, if you follow me to the palace, you will run into Vinian. He's also one of the young nobles who have been invited to the banquet, but you cannot kill him. That day is a very important day. If you don't kill when you see him that day, I will make you a promise. Later, I will kill that bastard and everyone related to him. I will tear them to shreds." Dragon glared at him. Kale come near to him and stroked his head. Kale said, I'll turn them into dust in the wind. Now, Kale looked at the dragon and thought, I knew the dragon would be more reasonable than I imagined. It looks like he won't be going on a rampage here. If he did, this place would just be blown to bits and I'd be a goner. Kale thought the situation and shiver. Kale heard the Venian footsteps and thought, he is coming this way. I guess since the northwest table is right beside us, he will have to pass by us. Kale drooped his head angrily. Eric looked at him worriedly and gave him the signal of quite. Kale looked at him like, how should I ignore Venian? Venian stopped at their table and said, Lord Kale, it's been a while. Kale rise up and replied with smile, yes, Lord Venian, this must be the first time we are seeing each other since we met at the Toll's estate. Neo was watching them confusingly. Eric and the other two also saw them worriedly. Venian Sten said, indeed, I was on my way back from visiting my close friend, Lord Neo. Kale replied with smile, yes I remember, we were supposed to share our drink in the capital. Venian said, yes that's right. Neo glanced at him. Kale said with sharp smile, yeah, the day after we met, a knight from Viscount Estate visited me. He told me the summer house was completely robbed of everything, so are you all right? Lord Venian, I heard you are close friends with them, I am sure you have heard the news. Neo looked at him angrily. Venian said flinching, yes, I did hear about that, it was such tragic news. Kale said, you have no idea how surprised I was to hear it during my hangover drink in the morning. Oh dear, there was nothing left, nothing. Everything was robbed. I hate you lost something very precious, is that right? Kale said to Neo, hang in there Lord Neo. I am sure something as inexplicable as this happens to everyone at least once in their lifetime. He replied, well, I suppose. Kale looked at him and thought, the most annoying type of person in the world is a loud mouth, a person who cannot read the room and a person without any ill intentions. Right now, I am three types, this is so fun. Kale opened his arms and said happily, you should just drink away those bad news. Lord Neo, tonight, we should drink the night away. Would you like to join us as well, Lord Venian? Venian closed his eyes and thought, I lost the trust of my family ever since I lost that black dragon. According to the knight's testimonies and the evidence left there, the group that gave us the dragon is the most suspicious, yet I cannot help but be suspicious of him since he was at the right place at the right time, and open his eyes. Kale said to them, all your bad memories will disappear once you drink away your hangovers too. Venian thought, but why would a lout like him stake a dragon? And said with smile, Lord Kale, thanks for the offer, but perhaps next time. Kale said, that's too bad, but sure. Also, they cannot that came to me was as pale as a ghost. Lord Neo, you should have been more truly prepared. Venian walked towards his table. Kale slid the chair and said to Neo who was still standing there, how could you lose all the precious items all at once? I am sure you won't get back what's been stolen, but it cannot be helped, you will just have to live with it. While walking to the table, Venian thought angrily, that lout, the dragon and that limping bastard, where did they all go? Neo looked at Kale angrily. Kale sit on his chair and said, hang in there, Lord Neo, and thought because Venian will give you an earful now. Servant continuously announcing the entering of the people. Kale grabbed a bottle. Eric called his name and stared Kale. Kale looked at him and said I'll have it later. Peoples were walking and talking happily. Venian was sitting on his table. Kale looked at the pocket watch and heard the needle voice. Door open and the crown prince and the other two prince comes in, they step on the stairs. Two prince stopped in the middle while crown prince went up and sit on the chairs and said, nice to meet you all, thank you for accepting my invitations. Kale looked at the watch and thought, he should be here any second now. Crown Prince said with smile, I am glad that the future pillars and the future heroes of this kingdom all came to this banquet. Door opened and someone come in, Prince saw him confusingly. Kale turned his head and thought with smile, he's here, what a perfect timing. Taylor Sten was sitting on the wheelchair while Kage was holding the chair. They all turned and looked at Taylor Sten and Kage. Kage was dragging Taylor chair forward, everyone looking them confusingly. Kale thought, I guess they both decided to just come clean and reveal themselves, a wise decision. Although the Order of the God of Death will have a headache, but that wouldn't be Kage's concern. Kage and Taylor were both smiling. Venian stand up from his seat and said angrily, what the? He looked very unhappy and angry to saw them. Whispering were started in the audience. They stopped in front of the prince's chair. Crown Prince stand up, open his hand and warmly welcome them. Crown Prince said, I didn't expect to see the eldest son of the Marquis Sten, Taylor Sten and the priestess of the god of death here. Taylor said, I heard there was an opportunity for the young nobles to meet and talk to the Crown Prince, so you came even though I wasn't invited. Prince smiled and said, I mean, I did ask for the representative of each family to come, but it wouldn't matter who comes, it Tat family has no representative. You must have been disappointed that I only sent out one invitation. He replied, just a little, Your Highness. Vinyan was standing and looking angry, people sitting around him were looked at him. Kale thought, a family without a representative, the Crown Prince just doubly insulted Vinyan for not being officially declared as the next hire. In the birth of a hero, the Crown Prince was always wary of the second and third prince, and the Stens are very close with the third prince, but that's the weird part. I know the current king favors the third prince, but it can't be that easy to depose a Crown Prince, and all the other nobles also each support a prince. Prince was standing high and Kaga and Taylor in front of him in the ground and everyone was watching them. Kale was also looking them and thought, not that I actually cared to find out about the details, but I guess something is going on. Crown Prince said, I'm sorry for having disappointed you. Still, I'm truly glad to see you on good health, it has been a while since we meet last time. Taylor said, Your Highness, even though I cannot move my legs, I still have my hands, head, eyes and mouth, all of myself is still alive. No, if anything, they've gotten stronger, Your Highness. Prince looked at him and said, I see, yes. You're still alive, I had forgotten that those who survive the longest are truly the strongest people. Vinyan was looking them worriedly. Kale thought, interesting, watching them go back and forth is also fun. The Crown Prince, Taylor, Vinyan and all the nobles from each faction, are all in this hair trigger situation and I just say, it's so fun to observe all of their faces. All I need is a bucket of popcorn. Prince looked at Kaga and asked, then, is there the priestess of the god of death? She replied, Greetings, Your Royal Highness, I am Kaga, the servant of the Enteral Rest. Prince smiled and said, let's talk later, we should all enjoy the banquet now. I just don't know where to seat you. Prince looked at the Kale table and said, actually I see the perfect spot. Kale looked at Pri8 and thought, it's here, isn't it? I guess this would be the only choice, our table without any great nobles. There are various families that have aligned themselves with great nobles of each faction, but we have a balance of power here. Also, this is the table where the richest and the strongest family of individuals' families, which not even the other great nobles can easily mess with, has chosen to stay neutral. Prince said with bright smile, Lord Taylor, you can sit at the northeast table, thankfully, they have many seats left. Taylor replied, thank you for allowing my attendance, Your Highness. Kaga also said, thank you Your Highness. Neo looked this confusingly. Prince said, not at all, you are both individuals who will be of help to the kingdom. Thus, the more the merrier. Servants come to the Kale table. Prince asked, may I rearrange your table a bit? Eric said, of course, Your Highness. They all stand up from their seats. Eric whispered in Kale's ear, Kale, you know right? Stay put, all right? They rearranged their table, and said, please sit. Kale slide his chair and sit. Taylor wheelchair stopped next to thee and he said hello. Prince said, then without further ado, let's carry on with the banquet. I always wanted to gather the man and woman, who will lead this kingdom further and share a great meal with them. Thank you for responding to my invitations and I hope you enjoy this banquet. Kale looked at the tailor. Vinyan was also looking at their table. Servants started serving the food. Amir to Kale, we'll go greet His Highness soon. Kale looked at her. He looked at the prince and thought, but what are his real intentions? There's no way that the crown prince really gathered all the nobles out of gratitude, there has to be another reason, I can already guess a few. He pulled plate and started eating. He thought, maybe it's because of the war that will start soon in the south of the western continent, or maybe he noticed a civil war brewing in the Whipper Kingdom. Well, I'm going to just stay out, so who cares about any of that? Dragon said to him, that looks delicious, you puny humans sure can cook great food, but there are magic video devices hidden everywhere in this hall. Kale grabbed a bottle. Eric asked him, Kale, can we have 5 minutes? Kale thought, I seen, for starters, Crown Prince is keeping an eye on the noble's children, I am sure the second and the third prince also known about this, that means the entire royal palace is behind this. Eric rise from his seat and said, let's go. Amir, Gilbert and Kale also rises from their seats. They went near the crown prince table and stand in front of him. Prince looked at them and said with big smile, it's the further lords of the northeast. Eric, Amir, Gilbert and Lark were standing in front of the prince. Eric said, greetings, your highness, it has been too long since I, Eric Wilsman, came to give my greetings. Prince said, yes, Lord Eric, we have something to talk about, don't we? Eric raised his head and looked at him. Prince's name was Alvar Crossman. His blonde hair is the proof of the sun god's blessing and is the defining trait of the royal Crossman family who rule over Rowoon. Eric replied, yes, I have been waiting for the moment to talk to you, your highness. Prince said, I have been waiting as well. You are the clever son of the Wilsman, who guard the entrance of the northeast, which is one of the pillars of this kingdom. I don't want to postpone our talk any longer. Kale stared him and thought, here we go, his silver tongue is working its magic. Prince looked at Kale and said, you must be the Lord Kale of the Any Truth who guard the ends of our northeast. I have never met you in person before, but thanks to the Hennidas family, I am no longer afraid of the dark forest. You have no idea much that puts my heart at ease and allows me to sleep peacefully. I also heard that you were a free spirit, Lord Kale. Kale blew down in front of him, forgetting. Prince said, I am sure the free spirits of the sculptors in the Hennidas state give you the inspiration you needed. I feel that your soul is as pure as it is free. Kale looked at him and thought, I cannot be easy enough to give such compliments to an infamous lout. I guess he really is amazing on a princely level, and said, I also realized something after I met you today, your highness. And shake hand with Prince. Kale said again, we have our king, his majesty, the son of the Rowoon, and with him, our people have you shining over them like the moon, for when they are afraid of the darkness, your highness. Prince asked, is that so? Kale replied with smile, that's right, your highness. After having met you, this star in the hearts of our people, I don't think I will be able to sleep tonight. Last my heart explodes from all these emotions. Eric, Amir and Gilbert looked him shockingly. Kale thought, I just took my first step in distancing myself from the crown prince. Why did this puny human card the crown prince dye his hair with magic? It's on a level that only a great dragon would notice it, so did another dragon dye his hair? Or is it some other power? Damn it, I just learned something useless again, a secret about his birth, is it? His pupils are dyed too. This puny human seems to have a scheme up his sleeve. Weak human, be careful. Dragon was flying above the head of Prince. Dragon said to Kale, this human is not weak. Weak human, be especially careful, you will die. Kale looked at Prince and thought confusingly, the crown prince is known to have average strength, but he is not weak. The current queen is the mother of the third prince. The crown prince was birthed by a concubine. She was just a maid working in the palace, a commoner. And it is said that she died mysteriously when the crown prince was still a child. Even Choi Han deemed him to be an average man, so what is he hiding? No, whatever he's hiding has nothing to do with me. Prince said, we might be quite similar, Lord Kale. He replied, that is truly an honor, your highness. It was like a battering talk. They let go of each other's hands. Kale looked at Eric and Eric was also looking him confusingly. Kale thought, so there was a reason, our reason as to why the crown prince is keeping an eye on the second and the third prince, and why the king suddenly favors the third prince. Is he not the biological son? Or is there another secret about his birth? Let's not learn anything new. Eric stepped forward to the prince. Gilbert and Amor looked at each other confusingly. Kale said to Amir, by the way, Lady Amir. She replied, yes. He said, I heard the coast in your estate are beautiful, are they really? She turned and looked at him and replied, they are amazing, the steep cliffs along the coast are very beautiful. Kale thought confusingly, beautiful? Please. Is there are cliffs, it's going to be really hard to obtain the sound of the wind, the third ancient power, the sound of the wind. It was a power owned by one of the non-Wizard Alliance members during the Civil War in the Whipper Kingdom. It was owned by a mad tyrant who appeared near the end of the Civil War and is also known as the Wizard Slaughtered, but this power did not mean much to him anyway. I guess the magic tower will fall soon. After the Civil War is over, the magic tower will collapse and the person mostly likely to become the owner of the new magic tower in the western continent is Rosalind Choi, the Wizard Slaughterer, and the Crown Prince of the Empire. these three people are involved in all the big events in the central and northern areas of the Western continent, and they emerge as heroes in the book. In the beginning of the book, it is also implied that the jungle queen of the southern jungle in the Western continent will unify the South and get tangled up with them in the further. Aside from the secret organization that Choi Han is after, this continent will soon become a war zone after 200 years of peace. Of course, that is also none of my business. They come to their table and sit. Kale looked at Gilbert and asked, Lord Gilbert, may I leave after this is over? He replied, of course, although we are going to meet the crown prince after the banquet, you don't plan on coming with us, don't you? Gilbert was sitting on his seat and Kale was standing near him. Kale said, no, I have nothing to do there, I am sure you three know more about the investment anyway. Gilbert was flinched hearing this and said, I see you read the document. Kale replied, I just skimmed through it. Prince said loudly, today's banquet was fun, we have prepared a light wine party for later, so those of you who want to go there can do so and enjoy yourself, and I have already prepared your seats for this year's birthday festival. I hope you can all come and celebrate the joyous day with me. Let's call it a day for now. Kale looked at him and thought, he's practically forcing everyone to be there. I cannot say I did not see this coming, but it looks like I will be at the plaza when the bomb goes off. Taylor Chair stopped near him and Kage said, see you later, kiddo, and they leave the banquet. Kale looked at them and thought, I said I don't want to be too friendly. Amir called him and said, let me see you out. Kale looked at her and said, Lady Amir, are you worried that I will get into trouble on the way out? She replied, unfortunately, Lord Neo is also leaving early. Kale thought, so she's coming with me in the case he starts picking a fight. They both went out from the banquet. Amir said, Lord Kale, you did well today. He replied, I did, although you will have to keep doing well, Lady Amir. She said, yes, because we need good results. Kale looked at her and thought, although she says that, she looks quite desperate. The coastlines at the northeast are really quite useless. There are whirlpools all around the coast and the steep cliffs that surrounded it. The trained sailors of the Amir state may sail their ships skillfully around the whirlpools, but this place is as dangerous as it gets for regular sailors. Of course, it's because of the sound of the wind. Amir and Gilbert will want to get investments on this useless sea no matter what. She said with hopeful smile, I think we can get the result is that we want. Kale said, Lady Amir, I am sure His Highness is very interested in the investment opportunity. She replied, it seems like it. Kale thought, they've worked hard today, so it cannot hurt to help them out a bit. The Northeast should stand strong, and according to intel, Lady Amir is not our loud mouth. He turned to the palanquin and asked, Lady Amir, you asked for an investment to turn the estate into a tourist spot, right? She replied, yes, I did. He stepped on the palanquin stair and turned his head to her and said with smile, if you need it urgently, you should think about the value of your estate and the cost between the Whipper Kingdom and the Northern Kingdoms. She looked him confusingly. He said, of course, I'd like you to keep that comment to yourself. She replied, I'll keep that in mind. He entered in the palanquin and Ron closed the door. The palanquin started moving and Amir was looking at, her hair and dress were blown by the wind. Kale was sitting in the palanquin and looking outside through the window and thought, although most of the northern western coast are made up of sandy beaches. The Amber and Gilbert estates have interact coastlines land many little islands, which are surrounded by many steep cliffs. They were only thinking about tourism because of this era of lasting peace, but the Crown Prince is aware that this peace is coming to an end. All I have to worry about is taking another inefficient power for myself before the wizard slaughterer ends up there. Palanquin was moving out of the palace. At the Kale house, Choi Han opened the door and come in the Kale room. Kale was standing. Choi Han was full of sweat and taking deep breaths. He told Kale that, we found 4 magic bombs, they were all placed around the plaza. Kale said, give me the map. Choi Han gave him the map and said, after we found one, I searched the perimeter with the dragon in my arms, so we ended up finding 3 more bombs. Kale opened the map and put it on table and looked at the map. Dragon was flying above them and cats were sitting on the couch. Choi Han said again, but no more than that, we ought to search outside of the plaza too, as we could not find any more in the common areas. Kale looked at the map and thought worriedly, 5 on people, 5 on ground, that was how it was in the book. Did he put 6 bombs on the people and 4 bombs on the ground this time? Or is there some other variable? Gale said, I will be safe until the day after tomorrow, when the king gives his speech, so let's not rush. Choi Han said, but we should still get rid of the threat as soon as possible. Kale said, well, stake it at dawn, in the day of the festival. Choi Han looked him confusingly and said, sorry. Kale looked at them and thought, the magic bombs explode only when its maker sends a signal. However, cutting off that signal is very easy. Far beings that are more powerful than regular scorers, like the Black Dragon and Rosalind, it just took a bit more time, but the act itself was not difficult at all. That's probably why Rosalind detached the bombs on people in the book. We have to take care of it on the day of. That's how that lunatic wizard would mistake that everything was gone according to plan. Choi Han asked confusingly, we're going to stake it, not destroy it? Kale smiled and replied, why would you destroy something so useful? I'm to use it, and thought, I am not going to use it as a bombard. They finally clustered power of mana in it is a useful ingredient. He said to Iran, there might be more, so keep searching. Also, make sure to keep checking that the bombs don't change their locations. He went near the cats and thought, from now on, Choi Han and the dragon need to stay hidden near the plaza at all times and constantly search the premises. I am sure it will be a tedious, difficult and nerve-wracking task. He looked at the cats and thought, it is time to earn your keep, and said get to work. Choi Han looked him confusingly. He sit on the couch and Choi Han and cats jumped from the terrace. Dragon was sitting in the tree branch, Palanquin was moving on the road. Kale and Lark were sitting in front of each other. Kale thought, the day before the festival of the birth of Rowoon King, I received news of Bilro's arrival in the capital. He remembered the day when Lark came in his room and he asked him for a deal. Kale asked Lark, you want me to look after your siblings? He replied, yes, that's my condition for the deal. Kale asked again, then what can you do for me? He replied, I won't be doing it alone. Kale asked confusingly, what do you mean? If you not just you, then who? He replied, my siblings will join me, we are stronger when we are together. Now, Lark said, the Blue Walls were once famous as a company of knights. Kale turned his head and said rudely, I don't know about any of that. Lark said, them, would you like me to explain? Kale replied, there's no need. Lark said, but still. Kale looked at him confused face and nervousness and thought, I should take Lark and 10 blue wolf cubs to create Dark Knight Company. When alone, Lark is terrified of the whale tribe, but if it was for his comrades, he'd lunge himself at their chieftain. That's just how he is, and I should take those who are even more fanatical than most cults under my wings. Kale raised his hand and said, stop being ridiculous, you want me to turn little children into knights? You asked me to protect them, but your condition seems like a paradox, and thought if I make them into knight from childhood, they them being wolfmen will turn them into something worse than fanatics. They did be a group of knights who are not afraid of death, Kale said, but what about their opinions? Why do you decide their life for them? Lark stared him and wiped his face and said shyly, I'm sorry. Kale said, there's nothing to apologize for. Anywhere, I now know what you want from me, so I will try to think of something I want from you. Kale looked at him and thought, of course, I already know what I want. I don't want it now, but in about 3 months from now. An ancient power that's worth a lot of money will appear in some dangerous mountain. I will be there for around 6 months and the Berserk Wolfman will be perfect to scale up that mountain. If I can sell the ancient power off to the Jungle Queen by exaggerating its worth a bit, then I can make enough money to last me a lifetime even after my family goes broke. I am sure royals have a lot of money, it won't matter if I take some of it. Lark slouched his head mad asked, do you think you'd ever need me? Kale looked at him disappointedly and said, don't ask such silly questions, of course I'll have a use for you. Lark said, I will do whatever your deal conditions state. Kale said okay and take out a money bag from his pocket and gave him and said, I'm sure you haven't seen your siblings in a long time, go tour the capital a little. Lark take the money bag and said shockingly, tour? Kale said, yeah, isn't this your first time in a big city? Go have some good food with your siblings, On and Hong go with you, so you won't get lost, and thought, I can't have a comfortable chat with kids around. On and Hong hugged Lark. Lark smiled and said, stop it, Hong On, you're tickling me. Kale thought, I should leave the wolf cubs with Hans later, or find a babysitter for them. I want it be someone who's clean and good at cooking. He remembered Vic Ross. He shivered and thought, who cares if he's good at cooking, cleaning and is usually well-mannered? He's all lunatic who loves to torture people. I cannot have him corrupt the pure wolf cubs. Palanquin stopped in front of the building. Kale come out and stand in front of the door. Lark also comes out. He raised his head and looked at the building confusingly. Kale said Lark to follow him. Kale and Lark went in the building. Servant welcomed them and said, "This is the fragrant vineyard, do you have company?" Kale nodded his head. Lark was holding cats in his arms. They stopped in front of the door. Kale said to Lark, "They're your siblings, so you should open the door." He replied, "Yes, and leave the cats in the floor." He put his hand on the door lock and opened the door. Children saw him and run towards him and hugged him, saying Lark happily. They were so happy to see each other again. Kale was standing near the Billows aside. Billows said, "Lord Kale." Kale replied, "It's been a while, Billows." Owner said, "It's nice to meet you, Lord Kale." Kale said, "Are you the owner of the caravan that followed him here?" He replied, "Yes sir, I've heard a lot about you from Choi Han. It's truly an honor to meet you, Lord Kale." Kale said, "Please, there's nothing great about meeting a lout. And shake hand with him." Owner introduced himself and said, "I'm Odious Flynn." Kale looked at him and thought, Odious Flynn, he was to be the next hire of the Flynn family, but instead he gave that up, and become the owner of a small caravan. In short, he is Bilros's uncle. He is also the man who introduced Choi Han to be Billows and the men who triggered Billows' greed. He's even more cunning than Ron. He keeps a small caravan as the front, when in reality, he is a man who wears a different mask in the underworld. He's nice to some and cruel to others, that's Odious. Kale said with smile, "A Flynn, you must be related to Billows, it's nice to meet you." Lark was talking with his siblings happily. Odious replied with smile, "I am surprised as well. I did not think Billows would be an acquaintance of yours. I had not seen Billows since he was a child, so it was very nice to see him. I believe I am becoming acquainted with good people as of late." Kale thought, the man who left the Flynn to live out the humble life, and the uncle who's known to be kind. Odious is the only person who Billows has good memories of from his childhood. Well, I guess he was nice to Billows. Billows was standing silently near to them. Kale said to Billows, "Let's go have a drink upstairs, Choi Han and Rosalind will join us soon. You can reconnect with them then." He replied, "Yes, Lord Kale." Odious said to Lord, "I hope to also have a drink with you soon, Lord Kale." Kale replied, "Sure, we'll do just that." He said, "Thank you, Lord Kale." Kale went near to the children and saw them. Kale thought, what a pain, maybe I should assign them a drill sergeant instead of a babysitter. No, let's not do something like that. He stand in front of them. They were looking at him. Lark was standing holding cats in his arms. Kale said, "You can get out." Kale went on the upper floor. Billows asked, watching the children, "My lord, just what are you up to?" Kale was sitting on a bench and replied, "What do you mean?" "I am just working toward my comfortable retirement." Billows looked at him confusingly and poured some wine and drank it. He put the glass on table and wiped his mouth with arm. Kale looked at him and said, "Can you not see me right now?" Billows poured wine again and said, "I was just really thirsty, I apologize, Lord Kale." Kale said, "I don't know why you are so anxious, but you should not be drinking alone." Kale pours wine in his glass. Billows called him. Kale asked, "Yes?" Billows said, "Lord Odious is my father's older brother, and so my uncle by blood." Kale thought, Billows is not allowed to bear the name of Flynn, which is why he cannot even address his uncle freely, but Odious was also the only adult who was ever kind to Billows. Odious said to Billows in his childhood that, "Billows, I think of you as my nephew and family, you have every right to be here." That's what Odious said to Billows in The Birth of a Hero. Those words motivated and set of Billows on his journey. Then he met Choi Han through Odious. Captivated by his strength, Billows started to follow Choi Han and even jumped into the race to become the heir of the Flynn merchantry. Kale was pouring wine. Billows said, "Lord Kale, st not you curious why Lord Odious runs a small caravan despite having the Flynn name?" Kale asked him, "Should I be curious about the Flynn name?" Kale raised his glass. Billows replied, "I guess not, the Flynn name isn't that highly regarded." Kale said, "That's right, both you and Odious are Flynns." Billows said, "I'm a bastard, Lord Kale." Kale said, "Just because you are a bastard, it doesn't mean you are not a Flynn, everyone out there thinks you are a friend." Billows called his name and said, "You really have a talent for speaking the truth." Kale smiled and said, "I do, don't I?" He held the wine bottle and gave him to Billos. Billos smiled and replied, "Which brings me to my point. What did you steal with the equipment you borrowed from me?" Kale said with smile, "I stole one thing and I am about to steal the rest of the things." Billos asked with smile, "Can I join you?" Kale said, "All seats are taken." He said, "Then, I guess I'll have to steal something else." Kale said, "Do as you please." They both started laughing. At Kale House, in the Kale room, Ron was standing in front of the Kale and bent down for greeting. Kale looked him confusingly. Ron said, "My lord, your humble servant would like to ask you for a favor." Kale asked, "A favor?" Ron said, "Please take care of my son." Kale asked confusingly, "Your son? You mean Vic Ross?" He replied, "Yes, my lord." Kale asked again, "Why?" Ron replied, "It's because I have to go fix hunting, my lord." "You know that I kill people, don't you, my lord?" Kale asked, "What about it?" He replied, "So I'm going on a trip to kill someone." Kale asked, "Without your son?" He replied, "Yes, my lord." Kale asked, "So the fix you're going to hunt is a person?" He replied with evil smile, "Yes, my lord, I must go kill a whole skulk by ripping them to shreds." Kale shivered by hearing this. Kale thought, either Ron or the ones he's after will be ripped to shreds. There are only two outcomes. The Choi Han party does not need Ron right now anyway. As long as Lark can go berserk freely, they don't need Ron or Vic Ross firepower. But watching him say all that with such a face is giving me the chills. It did be better if he did not smile. Kale brushed his hair by hand and said, "All right, you go do that." Kale sit in the bed and said again, "I will tell Hans to take care of your leave of absence, but report back to me from time to time. You can get the money you need from the flying merchantry by using your ID. Also, why would you ask a lot like me to take care of Vic Ross? He's a grown man, so he will manage his own life. He lay down and take blanket on him." Kale said, "And your leave period is only 1 year, and thought, I'll be able to sleep soundly for at least 1 year." Kale said, "Have a safe trip, don't come back all battered up." Ron looked at him. Ron out his hand on his face and thought, I thought this Grand Master was a pup, but it turns out that it is I, Ron Moreland, who become the dog, and said, "My lord, would a monthly report suffice?" He replied, "Yeah, whatever." Ron said, "Then, I'll to back in a year, my lord," and opened the door and went out. Kale opened his eyes and thought, he really is an assassin. I couldn't hear a single footstep on his way out. In the hall, Choi Han, Lark and Rosalind was standing. Dragon was sit in the shoulder of the Choi Han and Lark was holding cats. Kale comes and stand near to them. He said to Rosalind, "Lady Rosalind, brown hair also suits you well." She holds some hair in her hand and replied, "Doesn't it? It'll make it easier for me to go out." Kale thought, Rosalind does not know the full details of today's plan, but once she heard about the magic bomb, she realized the gravity of the situation and decided to help right away. Kale asked Lark, "You can still use the physical abilities of a wolf even if you don't go berserk, right?" He replied, "Yes, I can." Kale said, "Lady Rosalind and Lark will be one team. Then, Choi Han and the Black Dragon will be one and On and Hong will be the last team." Rosalind asked him, "What about you, Lord Kale?" Choi Han said, "Lord Kale will, in terms of physicality he's." Dragon complete his talk and said, "Weak." On said, "We don't need him." Hong also said, "He's useless." Kale stared at them. He was holding a bag and said, "I will just be a burden on you all. Also, I have to prepare to attend the festival as soon as the sun rises, so I won't be able to join you." He gave the bag to Choi Han. Choi Han looked at the bag confusingly. Kale thought, they will move during the time between evening and dawn, by using that little gap in time when the night patrol switches over from the Capitol Guards to the Royal Knights, they will be able to sneak in to where the bombs are hidden and disarm them. Then they will each stay in their hiding spots until the black marble goes off to disrupt the mana. And keep an eye out from the members of the secret organization and the situation at the plaza. The celebratory speech during the birth festival will begin at 9 o'clock in the morning. Kale smiled and said, "Now, get to work, everyone." Rosalind said, "We have to bring back the disarmed bombs. You did not forget about giving me one, did you?" He replied, "Of course not." She said, "That'll be my pay for a day's work." They all went through the door of the terrace. Kale closed the door and locked it. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, the protective shield was in front of him. He touched it and thought, it'd be best if I have never to use this, but even if I do, I'll use it lightly. Well, I'm sure I'll be fine. There's no way I'd get close to that bloodthirsty maniac, right? He get ready for the birthday festival. Ron was standing behind him. He said, Ron, today is the last day you'll attend to me. Ron replied, I'll have to continue on after a year. Kale was standing in front of the mirror, thought, that sounds horrible already. I'm going to send you over to Choi Han the moment you come back. He turned and said, let us prepare. Ron bent down. Palanquin was moving. Kale and Amir was sitting in front of each other. Kale asked, why did you ask me to join you? She said, Lord Kale, what do you think about building a new naval base in our estate? Kale thought, I got a letter from Eric saying that he's meeting with the Crown Prince regarding the investment for tourism to not go too well, so I heard that Gilbert and Amir were very disappointed, but she doesn't look disappointed to me. He remembered the letter Eric sent and said, I'm sorry it didn't work out after all of your help. Kale said with smile, haven't you already come up with answer? She said, yes, I've already contacted my mother because I feel that I couldn't decide by myself. I'm also planning on talking to Lord Gilbert today. Kale thought, building a new military base is not easy feat. It's not about the costs, but it's more about the conflicting interests of nearby regions, especially in peaceful times like now. That must be why the royal palace turned their eyes to the northeast. Not only was it the only region in the east that was by the coast, but there was also a balance of power in the northeast. Kale asked, Lady Amir, are you worried that the influence of the royal family will get stronger in your state? She replied, yes, Lord Kale, that's why I asked you to meet me today. Kale looked at her and thought, so, she wants to tell me something, and said, although I am curious about what you have to say, I will have to make one thing clear first. All the money in the account has need to family is handled by my father. When military forces are raised in cooperation between the royal palace and the local nobles outside of the royal estates, several detailed contracts are made regarding the chain of command and the practical dominance. The royal palace will probably allow a naval base to be built by the costs of the northeast and invest massive amount of money in it. If that happens, the royal palace will naturally come to command the entire base. This is because of the huge difference in manpower and resources required by deep base and the simple investment in the tourism that the Northeast originally suggested. Kale thought, Amir and Gilbert Estate are frankly quite mediocre. They won't have the resources or the manpower to minimize the gap. This is what Amir wants to prevent, which then leaves only one option, it is to borrow money from someone with lots of it. She said with smile, are you sure about it? The Crown Prince was wary of the Whipper Kingdom and the Northern Kingdoms. I could clearly sense it during our conversation, that's why I had an information guild look into it. Kale thought, I knew it, the Crown Prince and the Royal Palace knew about the brewing civil war in the Whipper Kingdom, and about the Northern Knights gathering their forces. Also, what a surprise, I hear things were not great for her, so much so that she had to rely on the Wheelsmans. But she bought intel on other kingdoms from the Information Guild? That must have cost a fortune. I must say, I like that she was not stingy when it came to making sure of things. Palanquin was moving continuously, she said, I hear the voice in the Count Hennet estates are undergoing repair. Since your family is famous for defending against all sorts of threats, I am sure you are also interested in military forces. He said, I will talk to my father about it. She said, we will also send Count Hennetus to an official letter. Kale thought, if naval base is set up in the northeast, the four families of Kale, Eric, Amir and Gilbert will command the northeast. I'll also be able to get other maritime help when building that naval base. She said, honestly, I'm a little worried about the whirlpools, but we do have seedlings that were paved a long time ago, and those whirlpools can work to our advantage when other kingdoms invade us. So I will have to work with it. Kale thought with smile, those whirlpools will soon become mine, so there's nothing to worry about. It might be nice to build a house by the coastlines of the northeast and enjoy my last days there. After all, I won't be able to live freely in the Hennet estate when I hand it over to Bassan. So I will just hide somewhere during a war, and once it's over I'll go over to Amir or Gilbert estate to build a house and spend my remaining days starting out into the vast ocean. She said again, anyway Lord Kale, I trust that you'll help me. Kale laughed and said, you trust a lout? I have no power at all, I'm just a messenger. She remembered her mother's words. Her mother told her that, Amir, you have to be careful if you don't have power, but you must be brave if you want to feign power. And she said to him, relying the message is enough, please come and visit the Yubar estate next time, we actually have many tourist spots. And held her hand in front of him. Kale shake hand with him and replied, I'll make sure to go there when I have the chance. She said, I hope that chance comes your way soon. They reached at their destination and palanquin stopped. Kale came out from it and Amir was coming by the help of servant. Kale looked at the pocket watch and thought, it's currently 8 o'clock, people attending today's event in the Plaza of Glory at the capital would have all gathered there an hour ago. Then at 8:30, the Royal Knights will control all who enter or leave the plaza, which will be filled with people. When the time comes and no one can move around freely, we will start our sequencer hunt. Necklaces, satchels and pendants, the magic bomb could be hidden in all these various forms and held by unidentified people. Choi Han and his party will find these people. Amir said behind the Kale, there you are, you're all here early. Eric and Gilbert comes near to them. Kale looked at them, it doesn't matter, they can't find it because the answer will reveal itself all in due time. Eric replied, yeah, we have to move at 8:05, and whispered in Kale's ear, stay put, you have to stay put today too, got that? Kale nodded and thought, right, I'm oblivious to all this, I don't know anything. They looked the crown prince and a royal man with him shockingly. Eric said, my goodness, how could it be? Kale was standing with them. Dragon comes and said, I'm here, all the bombs around the plaza are now being disarmed, it will all be disarmed at 8:55. Kale looked at him. Prince went into the palanquin and said, I'm busy, so I'll be get going. Dragon tapped on Kale's head and said, weak human, use your shield if you think it's going to hurt. Prince said, let's also get in our carriages. Kale saw the dragon flying above of him and said, my shield? Please, I probably won't even have to use it. Prince was sitting in his palanquin and servant said, all the preparations are done, your highness. Prince said, then let's go. Kale, Amir, Neo and the royal man was sitting in the one palanquin. Royal man said, it's good to see you, I can't believe I get to see all of you again after the banquet. Amir replied, it's good to see you, I'm Amir Yubar. Kale looked at them and thought, these members, is this the crown prince's doing? Neo also said, it's good to see you. Kale turned his head to the window and thought, things are really going to go down soon. Kale, Amir, Neo and Taylor Sten was sitting in the carriage. Kale looked at them and thought, however, things were already a mess in the carriage as well. He looked at Neo and thought, it seems he's really confused right now. I mean, I guess almost all these young nobles were confused. Especially Vinian, his face said it all. Who could have imagined that they abandoned in just son, Taylor Stan would stand from his wheelchair and walk on his 2 feet, or that someone from the stands would stand next to the crown prince. No, no one could have imagined it at all. He somehow managed to get the healing star from the crown prince. Amir looked at Taylor Sten and asked, Lord Taylor, are your legs all healed now? He smiled and replied, yes, it seems I was very fortunate, I am completely fine now. Neo looked very uncomfortable. She said again, congratulations. Taylor replied, thank you. Neo put his hand on his chin and looked at Taylor Sten and asked, since your legs are all better, will you go back to the Marquis estate now, Lord Taylor? Taylor said, go back? The Marquis's estate has always been my home. That place is where I belong, wouldn't you agree? Neo flinched by his words. Cake looked at Taylor Sten confusingly. Taylor was glances outside. A small man whispered in Kale's ear, Lord Kale, are you want to tell you all about it, it's a very interesting story. Kale thought, I think I can almost hear his thoughts. In front of the building, the palanquin stopped and Neo went out of the palanquin and said, then, I'll be getting off now. Amir also stand up and said, Lord Kale, I'll come back with Lord Eric, and thought since Lord Kale and Taylor have never met before, I'm sure nothing will happen. She opened the door and went out. Kale and Taylor were sitting in front of each other. Taylor said, we're finally alone, I fixed my legs as I promised to become the head of the Marquis state. Kale asked, did you pledge your allegiance to him? Taylor replied, no, we made a deal. Kale smiled and said, that's good, congratulations on your recovery. Taylor took out a paper form pocket and gave it to Kale and said, this is the details of the deal. Kale grabbed the paper and asked, why would you show this to me? Taylor said, I'll come in handy one day, Lord Kale Kage will be excommunicated soon. Kale asked, is it because she acted on her own? Palanquin was moving through the street. Taylor said, correct, she's quite happy about it. Kale said, that's good, and thought, she is finally on her way to becoming the crazy priestess. Taylor said, this is just the beginning, we will be victorious. Won't we, Lord Kale? Kale looked at him and thought, why would you include me in we? And said, you will. Palanquin stopped. Taylor stand up mad opened the door and replied him, thank you, then I'll be leaving first. Taylor got down and said, let's grab a drink with Kage after we win. Cake smiled and said, the wine from the Henadis estate is delicious. Palanquin started moving. Kale opened the paper and read it. It was written in the paper that, the Crown Prince wants to avoid a civil war. Kale crumpled the paper angrily and put it in his pocket. Palanquin stopped and Kale got down and thought, I knew there was some secret behind his birth. Amir, Eric and Gilbert came behind him and Eric called him. Kale turned and looked at them. Gilbert said, let us go, Lord Gale. It's time for us to enter. Cake thought, in birth of a hero Chauhan achieves a social status slightly higher than that of the commoners, but he was still nothing compared to the royals or their subjects. Cake stepped and raised his head and looked at the clock in tower. Kale thought, it is currently 8:25, it is the time that the rolls and the cabinet enter and the time that the commoners' movements are to be controlled. Gilbert looked at Kale and asked, Lord Kale, is this your first time at the plaza? Kale looked at him and replied, yes, I have only ever passed by it in a carriage. Kale looked around and thought, the tea shop to the south and the inn to the west, the flower shop to the east, and the roof of the Potters' Union building to the north all have one bomb each. Kale glanced at the man holding a flag and said, the plaza is pretty big. Gilbert looked him confusingly. Kale looked at the people and thought, things are sailing smoothly. A commander was standing in the door, where 2 guards were present and said loudly, we'll be closing the entrance now. Kale pinched and thought, the scavenger hunt has now begun. Of course, there is no need to really search like this, as the answer will present itself at 9:01. Servant said to Kale, please take your seats there. Taylor and Amir were already seated while Eric was sitting. Kale looked at them. Taylor said, we meet again, Lord Kale. Kale sat down on the chair and said, indeed, Lord Taylor, and thought, it's the same seating arrangement from the banquet. Eric looked at Kale and said, Kale, stay put, got it? Kale looked at him and said with smile, Eric. It was 8:40 on the clock at tower. Kale thought, I plan on doing nothing today. The clock on tower showed the time of 8:40. Servant said loudly, now entering, the starts of the Crossman royal family. Black Dragon said to Kale, there's 15 minutes left. Kale stand up and looked at the dragon and thought, this dragon sure is handy, there's nothing he can't do with his magic. A palanquin entered in which 2 girls and 2 boys were sitting, and in front of their palanquin, there was the palanquin of the Crown Prince. Kale clapped and thought, according to the dragon, the Crown Prince George and Ice have been dyed. They are supposed to be brown, common color in Rowun. Servant said again loudly, here comes the son of Rowun, His Majesty, the King, Zed Crossman. A man in middle age came, people raised their hands. Kale turned and glanced at them and clapped. The flower pot in the roof of the house started shaking. Kale looked at the pit and thought, so it's been disarmed. Zed Crossman was standing high from everyone and a mice was placed in front of his. Everyone looked at him. He raised his hand and everyone got silent. He said, it has been 30 years since I became the ruler of this kingdom under the blessing of the sun. Kale looked at him and thought, he seems genuinely happy about it, but unfortunately. He looked at the clock and thought, it is now 9 o'clock. Eric raised his hand, looked confused. Amir also looking up and asked, what the? People also looked up confusingly and asked each other, what is that? What is going on? A man pointed his finger and asked, who are they? A man in hoodie was standing in the tip of the building. His face was covered with veil. Commander asked him, who are you people? Get down from there right now. He ordered his subordinates, everyone, get yourselves up there now. Kale thought, Redika, the bloodthirsty, mad wizard. I was worried that he might not show up since some parts of the book have played out differently. I would have been a hassle to go looking for him if he did not show up. I mean, a hassle for Choi Han, not for me. He remembered it was written in the novel that, Choi Han could hear the Mad Wizard foreshadowing the atrocities to happen at the plaza. Mad Wizard laughed, made fire and said, "This is going to be fun. It is as it is written in the novel." He again made fire and throw it in peoples. They run away to save their lives. Choi Han and Rosalind looked at her angrily. Gilbert looked confused. Kale looked at him and said happily, "I found it and thought, 10 minutes, it might not be enough time to disarm the bombs on people, but it should be more than enough time to teleport to the mountain far from the capital, where no one is allowed to enter." Dragon came near the Kale and said, "Human, I found one." Kale listened him and thought, "After all, we have Rosalind and the Black Dragon." Choi Han hold a man. Man asked scarily, "What do you want?" "Let me go." Kale looked at them. Choi Han looked his necklace and said, "That must be it, nice and clean." He pulled the necklace from his neck. Eric hold Kale from back and said, "Kale, I have been calling you." Kale looked at him confusingly. They stand up. Kale looked at the prince where Commander said to him, "Your Highness, you'll have to evacuate for now." Kale looked at Prince Hairs and thought, the Crown Prince Hair. Dragon asked Kale, "Did another dragon die it? Or is it a different power?" Kale thought, is what the dragon said, seeing as how it's not becoming unknown, maybe he used magic that doesn't use mana? Eric called him again worriedly, "Kale, come in, we have to go, now." Mad Wizard continuously attacking people and laughing. He said, "How annoying." They all Mad Wizards were attacking. Dragon said, "One more human and another one." Kale thought, it is 9:04, and we found 3 people. Eric called him worriedly. Amir, Eric and Taylor were standing in front of him and Eric said, "Lord Kale, we don't have time for this, we need to leave now." Taylor also said, "Yes, we need to evacuate." Kale looked at them and grabbed Eric from shoulder and waved his other hand back and said, "Eric, calm down." They hear the voices and looked at the gate where members of nobles were standing and speaking to open the gate. Guard said, "Please wait." They said angrily, "You want us to wait in this situation? All the nobles are trying to escape," I said, "Open the gate." Kale looked at them and thought, what a mess. Eric adjusted his glasses with finger and said, "Thank you, that woke me up. Now you're back to yourself." Kale thought, it's 9:08, we only have 2 minutes left, since the wizards have begun to stabilize the mana disruptor will become ineffective soon. He looked at Choi Han who raised a bag in front of Rosalind and thought, that's another bomb disarmed, that's 4. Now we just need to find 2 more. Once the mana is stabilized, all the mana in the air will fly toward the magic bombs again. I am sure 2 minutes is more than enough time, it's all over now. Kale said confusingly, "What?" Taylor looked at him and asked him, "What is it, Lord Kale?" Kale thought, there are only 4 bombs. I am sure that the book said there were 10, did the numbers change along with story? They turned at the people who screamed. 2 men pointed on the sky where white stones showing and said worriedly, "Activate mana stabilization." They were many in numbers and they burst. The protective shield around the plaza protect the plaza. Bombs passed out the shield. Kale looked at the situation and thought, that's the Black Dragon and Rosalind for you, the bombs made it past the barrier, so that's good. Bombs were through to the mountains. Mana stabilization got complete. A man looked his hand confusingly. Zed Crossman and Crown Prince also looked this shockingly. Kale also looked this. Taylor said, "Those are the magic bombs." Kale thought, any noble who knows a bit about magic knows there's only one thing powerful enough to explore like that. I guess there really were only 4 booms. Dragon said, "We saved them." He again said happily, "I saved them." Kale thought, no one died, just as I has planned. Mad Wizard looked at the mountains where bombs exploded shockingly and said, "It's a pity that no one died, why did those bombs explode over there?" So this one failed. Zed Crossman asked, "What have you done? Who are you people?" Kale thought worriedly, wait, this one failed? Does that mean there's something more? Zed Crossman looked at the commander and asked the commander, "Do you think you will just get away with this?" Guards. Commander ascended the stairs and said to the guards following him, "Go up there and catch them." Mad Wizard said, "I guess it can't be helped," and clapped. 2 more Mad Wizards land near him, they were wearing bags. Kale looked at the bags and thought, that's it, that's where the other 2 bombs are. Mad Wizard tore up a shield. Kale thought, shield, acceleration and magic for self-immolation, he had prepared expendable minions. Mad Wizard tore the shield into pieces and said to others, go. The other jumped. Commander said, stop them. People started running. Kale looked at them and said, they're coming this way. Eric said him worriedly, let's go, Kale. Taylor also said, Lord Kale, hurry. He looked at them. Dragon said, I'll go over there. Kale thought, it's too late to run now, getting off a few seconds head start won't save us from the explosion. Wizard's bags started opening. Kale looked at them and thought, if the bombs blow up, then I might lose an arm but it will regenerate thanks to the energy of the heart. But these people will get hurt no matter what and they cannot grow back any limbs that they lose. This calls for a change of plans. Dragon came near to him with Rosalind and said, I've brought her here. She called his name. She looked in anger. Kale was standing behind her. She made a shield around them. Mad Wizard raised his hand towards the bag and transfer mana and said, explode. Kale raised his hand and made shield around the wizard man. She looked him confusingly. The wizard man came near to their shield. Dragon said, I'll block too. They were blocked in the shield. Rosalind turned his head to Kale and asked, Lord Kale. Kale was putting pressure to maintain the shield, he said, damn it. Bombs exploded in the shield. People sat down and put their hand in ears. A man said with pain, my arm. A woman also sat near to him and looked injured. Taylor and Eric looked this shockingly. Eric said, what is? The shield broke. Kale's hands were raised and thought, that explosion was huge. Kale fell on his knee but he smiled on his victory. Rosalind called his name. She sat near him and asked worriedly, Lord Kale, are you all right? Kale looked his hands and thought, that stings, I hate pain. I could save the bit of my power thanks to the black dragon but it still hurts. Amir, Taylor, Eric and Gilbert came near to them. Taylor called high name worriedly. Eric asked him, Kale, are you all right? Kale said, I'm all right but suddenly blood came from his mouth and he started coughing, his hand was full of blood. Eric shouted, blood. Kale rubbed his chest and thought, that is the power of the energy of the heart, I can feel its energy stabilizing my body. All my limbs are intact and my palms sting a bit but it hurts less than a paper cut and that one cough made my body feel much better than I did felt in moments. He smiled and thought, I could get used to this, I can see why all the heroes never gave up on their ancient powers. Rosalind held him from shoulder. Taylor asked worriedly, how can you be smiling right now? Stop smiling. He looked him confusingly. Taylor shouted, you don't even have to force your eyes open. Kale looked at him confusingly and thought, what's with him? Dragon yelled at him, weak human, you cannot die. You are too weak, if you die, I will kill everyone here. Kale looked at him and said, come on. Dragon said again, I will crush them all, I will destroy every single one of them, including myself. Kale thought, I know he means well but what chilling words, they are ringing in my head too. Amir ran and said, Lord Kale, I'll go call a priest. Eric ran after her and said, I'll go with you. Kale looked at them and thought I am not hurting anywhere but I guess I could use a checkup and I need to see like I am hurting but more importantly. He looked at the Choi Han who was standing in front of the guard. Choi Han said please move. Guard said angrily, civilians can't enter the plaza. Choi Han asked angrily, civilians? Who came up with that word? Kale waved his hand and thought, I told him to lay down. Choi Han looked at him. Kale waved him that don't come here, go away. Choi Han looked at On and Hong sitting in his shoulders and said I'm sorry. On came into his hands and said, there's no need to apologize. Rosalind asked him, Lord Kale, are you all right? He replied, yes, I'm great. Rosalind looked at him and thought he says it so nonchalantly, but what he did is incredible. I don't think even I could have done that, and I'm royal. She said to Kale, you're really hard to read. Kale stared her. She also looked at him confusingly. They looked up shockingly. Mad Wizard was standing up and laughed. He said, I didn't see this coming at all but this is fun too. He looked at them angrily. Kale and Rosalind looked at him. He looked at Rosalind and said, you're the woman I saw in the Blue Wolf tribe's village. He laughed and put his hand on his face and said, my word. A guard was holding a bow and aimed his arrow to him. Mad Wizard said again, so many things in the color of blood, I love it. I'd live ho hang up all of you as decoration. Kale said angrily, are you insane? He looked at Choi Han and thought mad characters like that usually don't live for long. Choi Han also looked at him and nodded his head. Guards attacked Mad Wizard with arrows. Mad Wizard looked at them angrily. Zed Crossman flinched. Mad Wizard waved his hand and said, well, then see you next time, and disappeared. The arrows hit each other. Kale thought, Redika took all his men back with him and disappeared into the air. Teleportation was always that bastard go-to trick, no one here would ever know where those bastards went. But the birth of a hero reveals Redika's exact location. Choi Han, On, Hong and Lark all went to the place that I told them about. If Redika and the secret organization really did go there, they will meet their deaths at Choi Han hands. I am just worried he might be go berserk. But he will be fine since, I'm send 3 kids with him to prevent him from going berserk. He will be able to control himself if they are around him. After all, Choi Han weakness is young and feeble things. Kale get up. Zed Crossman was standing in front of the mice and said, I will do my best to restore our kingdom from this horrible disaster. So I hope that you will all cooperate with the royal palace and do your best to stabilize your lands. We will be postponing the festival to a later date. Everyone clapped. Kale and Rosalind looked at him. Crown Prince was standing near to him. Kale looked at Rosalind and thought, Rosalind last post to stay hidden as much as possible but looks like he's tapped out for me. She must have stepped out, seems we cannot let others see the black dragon yet. Rosalind looked at him and said with smile, it's a secret. Kale smiled and thought, she really is a sensible person. Early this morning, before we begin, I told these 6 beings around me to keep a few things in mind. First, the dragon and demi-humans must hide their identities no matter what. Second, even if Choi Han and Rosalind identities are revealed, insist that you are here by coincidence. And lastly, don't get in each other's way. Amir ran towards Kale and called his name. Priest was also with him. Kale turned and looked at them. They stopped near him. Priest asked him, are you alright, Lord Kale? Kale raised his hands and said, it stings a lot, please take a look. Priest laughed. Kale said, protecting things sure is a tough job. Priest looked his hand and replied, yes indeed. She smiled and said, I saw your silver shield, Lord Kale, what you did was truly amazing. Crown Prince descended the stairs. Kale looked him with side eye. Kale smiled and said, this must be your first time seeing an ancient power. Someone grabbed on his shoulder. Crown Prince said in his ear, I see. Priest bent down his head and said, Your Highness. Kale also bent his head and thought, it's happening, since I had to show him one of the cards up my sleeve, I should get everything I can while I can. To sacrifice myself then take nothing but honor and glory, it's not my cup of tea at all. Kale smiled and Prince looked at him confusingly. Kale thought, money is better than honor and I did rather be a rich man than a hero. Prince took step towards him and said, Lord Kale. He hugged Kale and said, thank you, you did so great. Prince whispered, Lord Kale, you are one of my kind, aren't you? Kale thought, yes, I sure am, he sounds really bitter about it. Prince said, I'll make sure that you don't have any hindrances and I will reward you heftily. How does that sound? Kale hugged him back and thought, well, if you say. He laughed and said, no, Your Highness, I only did what I had to. Dragon said to Kale, human, something is off. Kale thought, as expected of the black dragon, it's very perceptive even at its young age. Since what's done is done, I will just try to take at least a place room's worth of money from the Crown Prince. At near the carriage, Crown Prince and Kale was standing. Near them, Amir, Gilbert, Rosalind, Eric and Taylor were standing. On the other side Vinian and Neo was standing. Crown Prince said, Lord Kale, you should get in first. At least for today, I will show you the respect you deserve. He replied, no, Your Highness. How could I get all before the shining star in the people's hearts? I could never. Your Highness. Dragon was flying near to him and said, human, is your head all right? Crown Prince said, no, no. This is my way of showing you my respect. Kale said, then, as incompetent as I may be, I'll get in the carriage first. He turned and looked where the Emir and others standing and thought, they look like they're worried about me and over there. Vimian thought angrily, where did that lout get such powers? No, why did he even act like that? Kale thought, he's probably thinking along those lines right now. Neo and Vimian looked at him angrily. Kale stepped in the carriage and thought, I guess I'll be able to get rid of one minor villain this way. Prince sat in front of him and said to servant, make sure you treat the lady behind us like the most esteemed guest. He replied, yes, your highness. Kale looked at Rosalind from window and thought, and I don't even have to worry about her, since Rosalind is very trustworthy. Carriage started moving. Kale was sitting with the crown prince in carriage and thought, royal carriages sure are different, where do they even find such leather for these seats? Crown prince asked him, do you need treatment? Kale flinched and looked at him, he was also looking at him. Kale said, my body is fine, but should not I be cared for by the best medical staff and priests? I think I should be prescribed bed rest for 3 to maybe 4 days. Crown Prince looked outside and said, sure, that may be best. The young nobleman who stepped out to save everyone is hurt and the royal place is doing all that it can to make him feel better. Very good. Kale nodded his head with pride. Crown Prince asked again, Lord Kale, are you related to them in any way? Kale looked at him confusingly and thought, I am sure he's talking about the ones who showed up in the plaza today. He remembered when he was descending the stairs Black Dragon asked him, why did not that Crown Prince do anything despite seeing people get killed? He has the power to stop them. Kale looked at him and thought, is he hiding his powers? He did not do anything even when one of his butlers died and stayed put when a young knight lost his arms and legs. He just stayed hidden, pretending to be weak. I thought he was a kind person despite being slightly manipulative, but I guess I was wrong. Kale said, Your Highness, why would I be involved in something so bothersome? Prince said, You're right and thought, yeah, a man who disguised himself as a lout would not do anything like that, it also seems like he had no choice but to help out this time. And said, the royal palace might carry out an unnecessary investigation on you. Kale said, I am sure your highness will help to prevent that, right? He replied, of course, you don't even need to ask. He pulled the curtain away from the window. People looked him in carriage and said happily, Your Highness. He looked at them, smiled and waved his hand and said to Kale, let us continue our chat when I visit you later. Kale called him. He turned his head and looked at Kale and said, yes. Kale said, I'll always have time to chat with the star of our kingdom. Prince looked at him. Kale said, I don't want what I did to be blown out of proportion. Prince said, I will try to control it as much as possible, I will make it so that the blame is taken away from the royal palace. Anyway, thank you, you saved countless people from getting hurt. Kale looked at him and thought, I cannot tell whether he's a good person or not. Actually, I am not even sure if he's human. Kale said, yes, your highness, and I'll look forward to my reward. Prince shook his head and said, yes. Kale thought, since he's not telling me to keep my expectations low, I guess I don't need to worry about the scale of my reward. Palanquin reached its destination and stopped. Kale was lying on his bed in the palace and eating grapes. He thought, they are treating me very differently from before, this is the best room only reserved for foreign royals. Well, I mean Choi Han's party also stayed in this room in the novel. Someone knocked the door. He get up and said, come in. Door opened and Choi Han, Lark holding kittens, Han and Rosalind came in. Choi Han said, Lord Kale. Hen looked at him and said, Lord Kale, do you have any idea how worried I was? Kale got down from the bed. Han ran towards him saying, my lord. Kale stopped him with a hand gesture and said, stop right there. Please come in, all of you. Han said, I have connected your family about this, I thought it did be best to tell them before the royal palace does, so I used a magic communication device to let them know and that cost quite a bit, my lord. Kale said, good job. Han glanced at Rosalind and said, also. Kale thought, I guess he recognized her and said, go on. He said, I have told all the workers at the mansion to keep their lips tight about Lady Rosalind. Rosalind said, well done. Kale also said, good job and thought, since we have not come up with the story yet, I will be good to have everyone keep quiet for now. Han looked at him and said, "My lord." He replied, "Yes." Han said, "Although I did report to your family first, I think you should still contact them yourself later. Otherwise, Count Hennetus might come to the capital himself." Kale thought, "My father is definitely the type to do that." Han said, "Then, I shall now go and talk to the caretaker of this mansion." Kale waved his hand and said, "Okay, you can leave." He went out and closed the door. Dragon was sitting near the Kale couch and said, "Kale, human, there are no visual or voice recording devices in this room." Kale thought, he might not seem like he wants to do it, but he showed us everything I tell him to. And he does well. A room for Rosalind of Foreign Kingdoms, having recording devices in such a room would mean one wants war, not peace. So this means we can do and say whatever we want here, but... Rosalind said, "Better to be safe, right?" Kale looked at her and said, "That is one of your best qualities, Rosalind," and thought, she cast a spell to make this room soundproof. Now then. He looked at Choi Han and said, "Choi Han, go ahead." Choi Han greeted him and raised his head and looked at Kale. Kale looked at Choi Han and said, "Choi Han, go ahead." Choi Han greeted him and raised his head and looked at Kale. Choi Han sat in chair next to Kale and said, "The mad wizard showed up at the place you told us about, so I tried to kill him, but his minions had attacked us. Clearly, they were ready to throw their lives away." Kale said, "I agree." Choi Han remembered when he went after the mad wizard with kittens and fight with them. He looked at the mad wizard and said, "The people that I care about have either died or almost died because of you once again." He ran to attack them. Kale asked him, "So did you lost them?" Choi Han said, "Yes sir, all I managed to do was cut off his left arm from his shoulder." Kale looked him confusingly. Choi Han said, "I was worried that he might come back and reattach his arm, so I had burned it. His left eye is injured too." Kale thought, it's not that critical damage for a visit. They need both hands to cast magic, so that is serious damage to the balance in their mana. Choi Han clenched his hands and said, "I should have finished him off, I'm sorry." Kale looked at him and said, "I mean, there's no need to apologize, you did well." And thought, more importantly, the kid seemed sacred. He looked at the lark and kittens and thought, did he go berserk? And asked, "What happened to Retica minions?" Choi Han replied, "I figured it did be best to kill them, so I made sure to take them out. It probably is better that way." Own shivered with fear. Kale asked again, "You did not destroy any buildings or anything, right?" And thought, if he went berserk and destroyed the area, I might have to clean up after him. Choi Han replied, "Yes, of course. I did my best to minimize all collateral damage just as you ordered me to." Lark was sitting with kittens next to Choi Han and Rosalind was also sitting near him. Own and Hong got off his swing and ran towards bed where Black Dragon was sitting and sat near to him. Kale thought, they must be scared of Choi Han. Black Dragon patted their heads. Own said, "Black Dragon is the cutest." Hong also said, "He's the nicest." Kale smiled and said, "All right, good job. You all did amazing work today, you are the reason everyone is still alive. Same goes to you, Rosalind." She smiled. Lark and Choi Han looked at him. Kittens were playing. Black Dragon said, "Good work to you too, human." Kale exhaled and said with smile, "Yes, I did well too. Which means you should all be rewarded, you may leave." They all went, door opened and Crown Prince came in. Kale was laying on his bed and said, "Your Highness." He asked, "Do you feel all right?" Kale replied, "Yes, Your Highness. It's truly an honor to have the Crown Prince pay me a visit." Prince shivered and said, "Stop, you're giving me the creeps." Kale said, "Thank you, Your Highness." Prince sat in the chair near to his bed and said, "Sure, you officially been put on bed rest. Your actions in the plaza were done because you wanted to control the situation as a nobleman, even though things were just as bad for you. Since you had already announced at that spot that you possess an ancient power, we went along with it and said it was a defensive power that is not that strong. That's what you wanted, is not it?" Kale snorted. Prince said again, "A weak noble who stood up for his kingdom, that sounds good." He laughed and said, "It does. You will receive all rumors and reports regarding you and the current situation through your butler tomorrow. You should look through them." One more thing. Dragon was sitting in the bed in front of him and glancing at him. Dragon said, "I can tell for sure now, he's not human. Prince looked at Kale and said, you are human, right? Kale looked at him confusingly and thought, come again. Kale said, of course, and thought, why would he ask that me? Prince coughed and said, of course. You're human, you and I both are human. Dragon glared at him and said, he's lying, he's not entirely human. Kale set him in signal, Dragon, can you stop now? I keep knowing things I do not want to know. Dragon said angrily, I have never seen such a being during the 4 years of my draconic life. Kale thought, 4 years of draconic life. All he's seen were a dragon, humans, then cat and wolf beast men that he met recently. That means the Crown Prince is none of the above. Kale said, yes, Your Highness. There's nothing special about being human. We are all human if we live among each other. Prince looked at him and said, right, nothing special also. Kale thought, he has more to say. When will this end? Prince said, I must not show at the banquet hall, but there is a weird smell hanging about you. Kale looked at him. Prince said, there is a weird smell hanging about you. Kale sniffed his arm and said, a smell? But I washed up right before you came in. Prince acted as dumbfounded and laughed and said, there's no need to sugarcoat anything since we already know what the other is like. What would you like as your reward? Prince thought, Kale Henitus, the famous lout of the Northeast, although he has been pushed aside from the line for the title, he seems unbothered about it. There are no signs of any conflict in the family. He's known as a lout who doesn't like to work and acts like a dog because of his bad drinking habit. However, the man in front of me is no lout, even at this moment. Kale asked, Your Highness, then could you first tell me what I have to do? Prince replied, I don't want you to say anything to the nobles. And thought, there's no way a lout would say these things. Prince said again, and praise the royal family once in a while if anyone even ask. Kale asked again, along with words about how generous our crown prince is? He replied, that's right. Kale thought, what happened to take could be seen as an embarrassment to the royal family. I suppose they cannot have the nobles scorn on them for this. That's why they are going so far as to bribe me. Though this only works because I am a Henitus and Henitus are always neutral, Crown Prince said, since it's an ancient power, didn't you show everyone everything you have? Kale smiled and said, of course, that power is only good for that. Kale thought, in the birth of a hero the Crown Prince was more knowledgeable about announcement powers than anyone else. Of course, that's before I became killed though. Actually, did not the book say that his ancient power, the healing star, was given to him by his mother? Crown Prince asked him, so what would you like as your reward? Kale turned his head and looked at him. Prince said, your own family? The investment for northeastern coasts? Or the stability of authority in the northeast? Kale shook his head and said, 9 of those are for me. Prince asked confusingly, not for you? Kale tapped on his chest and said, you want a reward for me. Prince laughed and thought, now, I can finally understand a lout. He may have lived as a lout, but he still is human. No, all living beings want to climb higher and own everything. What's more important than family and the people around you is yourself. Prince asked him, so what would you like? You own title? Or a medal? Do you want your own political footing in the capital? Kale smiled and said, I want money. Prince asked confusingly, what? And smiled. Kale said again, I want money, Your Highness. I don't want a medal or a title. And thought, what good are those when a war will break out soon? Those things are useless, cold, hard cash is the best. Dragon asked him, why are you laughing, human? Kale thought, it's better to take cash and exchange it for something real such as food or land. Also, the last ancient power that I will get after the sound of wind becomes a stronger depending on how much money I spend on it. Prince glanced at him and asked with smile, are you going to use the money to buy wine? Kale said happily, how did you know? Prince looked him confusingly and thought, is he serious? Prince stand up and said, all right fine, have a read through the report when it comes in tomorrow, then tell me the amount you want. Kale asked him, are you going to visit me again? He asked him instead of answering, why, you don't want me to? Kale sparkled and said, it'd be my entral honor, Your Highness. Prince looked at him, he turned, waved his hand and said, forget it, just get some rest. Prince went out. Dragon asked, human, is there something other than mana that can dye his hair? Kale turned his back towards him. Dragon touched him from back and asked again, answer me, human. What is it, if it's not mana? I'm curious. Kale closed his eyes and thought, I'm going to ignore him. From now, I'm a patient on bed rest. Dragon continuously calling him that in the morning, Han came in Kale room and bowed his head. Kale was sitting on the bed in the blanket. Han gave him an envelope and said, Ron has left as planned. Kale picked the envelope and opened it. It was written in the paper that, my lord, I'll report to you once every month. I didn't know you were hiding such a power. I heard what the mad wizard looked like from Choi Han, I'll make sure to remember it. I have also told the same to Vic Ross. Kale read the letter and out it in the table. Han said, I'll take my leave them, my lord. Kale said, sure, and thought, now that a former assassin in his son now his face, Retica might die at Ron's hands if he ever runs into him. In the palace, Eric, Amir and Gilbert visit Kale. Kale was lying in the bed and On and Hong were sitting near to him while the other three were standing near to his bed. Eric said, I heard you were very ill. Kale replied, I have no energy in my body. Eric called his name worriedly. Kale pressed his belly and said, I also feel a bit bloated, and thought, I guess it's because I have been eating while laying down all day. I cannot even eat anymore because I am so full. Eric sat in chair next to him and said worriedly, tell us if you need anything. Amir also said, that's right, we'll get you whatever you need. Kale looked at them. On and Hong stared him and shake his leg. Kale said, bye, it doesn't seem like you're here for just a simple visit. Eric looked at Amir, he turned and gave an envelope to Kale and said, this is the revised version of our proposal regarding the investment, we thought we should bring it for you. Kale picked the envelope and opened the envelope and looked at the paper. Kale thought, I guess everyone has their minds up about building a naval base. Eric said again, the news will also soon reach Count Hennetus, along with this proposal. Kale said, I see, then will you be meeting with the Crown Prince? Eric said, yes, we're meeting with him tonight. After all, we can only really get to work once they show an interest in this matter. Kale said, I'm sure it'll go well. He closed the envelope and said again, in the future, you should send these documents through your attendants. I know you're busy, so you do not need to bring these yourself. Eric said, no, I will keep visiting you, you also need to know about these matters. He stand up and said, we'll be going now, get some rest. Kale said, okay. Choi Han was standing near the Kale bed while Rosalind was sitting near on chair. Kale pressed his neck. Choi Han looked at him. Kale said, leave. Rosalind said, I'm sorry, Lord Kale, but I need Choi Han and Lark. Kale looked at her and thought, as Rosalind revealed herself to the Imperial Palace, she need to return to the Breck Kingdom as soon as possible. Especially because they'll start to get rid of all the assassination attempts against her since they know that she's still alive. But she can't go back by herself. The incident at the plaza revealed that she is at least a high-class witch, and so her enemies will react accordingly. That's why she needs strong people behind her. Kale asked her, why would you apologize? You helped us with a difficult task, Rosalind, it's only right that we help you too. You're Lark's older sister and your Choi Han friend, are you not? Rosalind said, thank you for saying that. Choi Han looked at him and said, I should be protecting you, Lord Kale. Kale said Choi Han and thought, I need him to leave if I want more space to go around and to prepare myself to go into hiding once the war breaks out. Kale said, I won't die so easily, and thought, I am going to save a lot of money and become strong enough to survive on my own and live a comfortable life. So I plan to live a very full life, and why would he worry about protecting me when I have a dragon with me? He's actually a burden on me right now, Choi Han said, I see, I must have been worried for nothing. Kale called the Lark. Lark came near to him. Kale said, I'll take care of your siblings, so go with Rosalind, then return to the Hennetus land in 3 months. Kale sat down and asked confusingly, pardon? Kale said, what do you mean by pardon? Have you forgotten our deal? Hennetus, that is where you need to be. That's where I'll be with your siblings, you must return. Lark opened the paper and said, a place to return to. Kale out his hand on his shoulder and said, that's right, you have a place to return to. Keep that in mind, you have 3 months, Lark said with bright smile, yes Lord Kale, I'll be sure to return in 3 months. Kale said all right, and thought, things have changed a lot from the original storyline, but I still want the main plot to stay relatively the same. That's why, I will still be able to rely on my knowledge a bit. It's a shame that I was not able to send Vikros away with Ron, but I guess that can wait until Ron comes back from his vacation. Han opened the door and came in. He stand near Kale's bed and said, "My lord." Kale looked at him and asked, "What is it?" He was holding a tray with a paper and said, "There's rumors going around that His Majesty the King wishes to award you with the medal." Kale picked the paper and opened it. It was written in the paper that, Lord Kale Henitus, continuing the dignity of the Henitus family, who have been protecting the kingdom from the dark forest for generations. Kale read it with disgust and thought, I did see this coming, but are you kidding me? 1 week later, at the Plaza of Glory, a man was driving the palanquin. Palanquin stopped and Kale came out of it. Dragon was flying above and said, "We haven't been here in a while." Kale walked in the street. Girls saw him with longing. He was walking with his guard. People looked at him. Someone said, "Wow, the young Silver Lord." Kale heard them with boredom. Someone behind him said, "Look there, it's the young Silver Lord." People turned and looked at him. Guard coughed and said with smile, "I guess that call you the young Silver Lord now, my lord." Indeed, great people deserve great titles. Kale listened him and thought angrily, darn it, Silver Lord or Shield Lord. I really wish I would not have to hear such cringe and embarrassing names. Kale said, "Perhaps if I grab a drink here and act like I usually do, they will stop calling me those names, right?" Guard coughed badly and said, "Since you haven't healed completely, I don't think you should be drinking yet." Kale looked at him and thought, that's right. Officially, I'm still sick and yet to fully recover. I hurt myself by using more an ancient power than my body was capable of using. He looked at his hands and thought, though, that's how I was able to miraculously stop the mana boom from exploding. Kale was sitting on his bed and there was a purple bolster and a purple bowl was stuff in his lap. Voice came out of the bowl, "Kale, were you able to see those bastards' faces? I will kill them all as your father." Kale looked at the bowl and thought, how scary. His father voice came again, "You can't even swing a sword properly, how dare they? The Henitus aren't staying put because we're weak, remember that. We have made a decision to stay low because we're so powerful." His father face showed in bowl. He said again, "No one will dare to bother you regarding this incident." Kale looked at his hand and thought, I guess my father was right about that. No one came looking for me, after I had left the palace and went back home. Not even Eric or the others came to see me. I could use more peace and quiet like this. Now, he was standing in front of a gate. Guard said, "Lord Kale." Kale looked at him and asked angrily, "Do you need to check my identification?" Guard gave him way and said, "You can head right in, my lord." Kale said, "All right, thank you, keep up the good work," and thought, that's got to be exhausting. Guard bent his head and said, "Yes, my lord." Kale went near from him. He looked at him from behind. In the hall, chairs were arranged. Kale stepped on stair. Eric looked him and waved his hand. Amir was sitting next to him. Cake said, "Eric, you were here already." He slid the chair and sat. Gilbert was sitting next to Amir. Everyone looked at him. He thought, everyone here heard one piece of news. They heard that Kale Henitus has refused to receive a medal which symbolize honor, and left someone else have it. They also heard that he attended this event despite not having completely recovered. Kale looked at sky and said, "Maybe it's for those who passed, but the weather is great today." Amir said, "I think it is because of your heart." Kale asked confusingly, "My heart?" And thought, what nonsense is that? Kale asked her, "You're leaving today, right?" She said, "Yes, and you're leaving tomorrow, aren't you?" "I suppose I'll see you at my estate soon." Kale said, "Yes, I'd live to see the ocean." Amir said, "Okay, and you're coming to get some rest?" He said, "Yes, indeed," and thought, "Rest, please. I am going there to get stronger with my perfectly healthy body. Of course, that's not the only reason I am going. You are right, when tomorrow comes all the nobles in the kingdom will hear one more piece of news. They will hear about the development and investment of a new naval base in the northeast. All have gathered here today will come to hear about it." Gilbert smiled and said, "We are in your hands, Lord Kale." Amir also said with smile, "We're all in your care for this." Zed Crossman stand from his seat and came near the mic and stand in front of it. Kale looked at him. Zed Crossman said, we have all gathered here once again to show the world that we will not be cowering in fear. Zed Crossman said, we have all gathered here once again to show the world that we will not be cowering in fear. Everyone was looking at him. Zed Crossman said, many have acted bravely in the face of a disaster. Thanks to those people, we were able to protect this land just as we did throughout the past. Kale looked at him and thought, did I just lock eyes with the king? No way, I must be mistaken. Dragon said to Kale in Kale's room, the blessings if the sun god? I don't feel any sort of divine power coming from those puny humans. The only peculiar one was the crown prince. Kale thought, so the divine power passed down through the Crossman blood is also a lie. That's another unnecessary information I've learned. Nothing good will come from finding out more, let's play dumb. Dragon was staring him. Kale said, let's keep this our little secret. Dragon said, got it now. Dragon and Kale looked at Zed Crossman. Zed Crossman said, in accordance with that, I will reward those who were extraordinary brave. Zed Crossman placed a medal on a guard uniform. They kneel in front of Zed Crossman. Kale clapped and Dragon said, humans are so weird. Villian came near Kale and said, Lord Kale. Kale and Dragon looked at him. Kale asked him, what is it, Lord Villian? And thought, Villian Sten, I didn't know he was still here. A lot of young nobles went back home when they realized the danger with the terrorists. I guess those who lead each region stayed behind. Villian said, I heard you refuse to accept the medal, don't you think it's a shame? Kale looked at him and thought, why'd he even asking me this? Dragon said angrily, I want to kill him. Kale said, calm down, not here. Kale thought, I refuse to accept the matter because I don't want to be written down in history. On the highest floor of the royal library rests the records of all the kings and on the floor below it rests the records of the heroes who were given various medals. The royal palace then finds out and controls the whereabouts of these heroes under the pretense of monthly incentives. Some may see it as an honor but I see it as a shackle. The war will soon break out everywhere, no one will even remember what happened in this tiny plaza for long. Kale stand up and hold the chair back and said it's not a shame at all. And thought, all that is not recorded will be forgotten. I don't need anything else. I was rewarded quite heftily and above all else. Kale smiled and said again, we survived, so isn't that enough? Villian said, I see. Kale said, yes, also, I'm much too cowardly and simple to receive a medal. Villian looked him confusingly. Zed Crossman said, that ends today's ceremony but I will not forget this moment. I will keep this in mind and remember it, and never forget the brave souls. Kale looked at him with boredom. Everyone put the flowers on the ground and prayed wishes for the dead. Kale looked at them and thought, the crown prince had told me that Jay didn't have to come to today's memorial service but I came anyway because I know the weight of a person's death. He tapped on his heart. Eric called him, Kale. Kale looked at him confusingly. Eric said worriedly, did you overexert yourself? Does you heartache? Kale looked at him. Eric coughed shyly and said, I guess not. Kale smiled. Kale thought, this is the golden plaque that I got from the crown prince as my reward. I can use it twice, whether it's buying 2 bread or even 2 mountains. No matter the actual value or the price of the item, I am giving 2 chances with this plaque. The crown prince is more generous than I thought. I am sure he gave it to me thinking I would not buy anything big, even if it was twice, or he might have given it to me as a test to see what I would buy, but he's gravely mistaken. Dragon asked him, what are you scheming this time? Weak human, be careful. Kale looked at him and looked people confusingly. A man said it's the Shield Lord. Girls also piqued him. He turned and started walking and thought, all these stairs will stop once I leave the capital. The next day, at the Kale house. Kale was sitting on the chair and in front of him food was served on table and Dragon was also sitting on the table. Kale was shaking the magic bombs on the table. Dragon asked him, what are you going to do with those? Kale replied, I'm going to destroy the whirlpools. Kale smiled and said, I'm going to destroy the whirlpools, and thought, I was not originally planning to do that. I was going to get through them using the shield and heart, but that's back when I did not have the black dragon. There's no need to work on hard when I have a dragon now. Dragon stared the food. Kale looked at him and said, eat up. Hong also climbed on the table. Kale said, I don't know what you stole, but you sure made it big. I'm quite famous, aren't I? Billows was sitting in front of him and said, yes, you're my lord, but is it all right to be drinking right now? Kale said, there's no need for me to be fake in front of you, right? Billows grabbed the wine bottle and poured wine in glass and said, I received the items that you returned and here is what you asked for. He placed a box on the table and slid it towards Kale. Kale looked at box and thought, I was wondering where I should use the gold plaque and I have picked out the first thing to buy. I have decided to buy time. There are those who pose a real threat to Rowoon. No, not just to Rowoon, but to all of the nations in the central northern areas. They are the knights in the north. In order to prepare for the moment that they come to Rowoon, I decided to purchase some time. More specifically, I wanted to get away from the empire at the center of the western continent, the wizard slaughterer, the jungle queen in the south and everything that gets in my way. That's why I need to buy time. It would not matter if I was alone, but now I have people under my wings. Kale asked, Billows, do you conduct trade as well? He replied, no, my lord. I don't do trade, but I do know one thing. The western continent is on the brink explosion and that's when merchants can make the most profit. Kale said, and all merchants will gather for money. The Whipper Kingdom will soon be under chaos. You saw this coming, didn't you? Billows nodded his head and said, that's why I am thinking about how to make money out of that. What do you think will bring in the most money, my lord? Kale said, people will, and thought, the Wizard Alliance will lose in the Civil War, then the Magic Tower will be destroyed. So what will happen to the surviving sorcerers? Not all sorcerers died after the Civil War. The Whipper Kingdom is the biggest producer of magic tools in the western continent, but there were also many wizards there who stayed away from politics and powers. So they all lost our place to stand after the Civil War. The person who came swooping in to take advantage of that was the Crown Prince, Alvar Crossman, and the person who will rebuild the fallen magic tower in a brand new location is the Archwitch, Rosalind. You believe that the sorcerers will fall to ruin. They have to. That's the only way the Whipper Kingdom will be able to flourish, but what I want is something different. The biggest producer of magic tools in the western continent, while also being the best producer of magic tools, is the Whipper Kingdom. What I need are the byproducts of the Civil War. Kale said to Billows, if the magic tower falls, be sure to tell me immediately. Billows asked him, may I ask the reason? Kale said, you'll find out when it happens. Billows said, I look forward to it, my lord. Kale smiled and thought, me too, I'll get the time I need after buying that. I will then have time I need to protect myself from danger, though it will cost a pretty penny. Well, it's not even my money anyway. He picked the glass and drank wine. Billows said, then, I'll contact you soon, my lord. Kale said, all right, I'll be waiting. Kale put the empty glass on table and leaning on the sofa and closed his eyes. He smelled something and opened his eyes and looked the thing confusingly and thought, what is that? A small covered by walked towards him and black mana was emitting from it. Dragon said, I can feel divine power coming from that. Kale looked at the thing and thought, that crazy priestess, and said, Kage. She waved his hand and said, I knew you'd recognized me, Lord Kale. This golem is connected to me. It's also a one-time use golem used for speaking and healing. Kale thought, Rosalind truly does deserve the title of necromancer that she had in the book. It must have noticed that it had no sight right away. He looked at Dragon and thought, how strong is this dragon to be recognized the minuscule divine power inside a golem? Kage said again, we're leaving the capital today, I'm sure that you don't want us to contacting you like this, right? Kale thought, of course not. Kage said, Lord Kale, when I've returned to my place. No, when I've gotten to a place higher than my place now, then I'll return to repay your favor. Is what Lord Taylor wanted me to tell you. Kale pressed his head and said, there's no need for that though. Kage said, I know, but Taylor and I both need at least one person to share our news with once we get what we want. Kale said, do as you want. Kage said, then I'll pay for your health, Lord Kale. And the golem disappeared. Dragon asked Kale, so is that when I'll get my revenge? Kale replied, yeah. Dragon looked him happily. Kale thought, the moment Vignan Sten and the current Marquis Sten are engulfed in despair is when the Black Dragon will also get his revenge. Kale said to Dragon, you can do whatever you want then. Dragon flapped and said happily, nice. Kale picked the glass and thought, he seems ecstatic about it, what a scary creature. What a scary creature. That night, Kale spent a hellish night as he fell asleep to the lullaby of the Black Dragon's revenge plan. Rosalind was sitting in the carriage and Dragon was sitting near to her. She gave him some books and said, "These are the books on the Rowan language and these books are on the common language of the continent." Dragon slid the books towards him and said, "Thank you, human. I'm great, so I'll learn the language quickly." Rosalind smiled and said, "That's right. You are great, Lord Dragon. I hope you find a nice name for yourself." Dragon said, "I'm and to ask someone else to give me name." Rosalind glanced at the Kale. Kale was standing outside with Choi Han. Kale looked her confusingly. Rosalind laughed and said to Dragon, "I can see what Lord Kale means to you." Dragon said yes. Lark was standing near to Kale and Choi Han with his siblings and said to his siblings, "I'll make sure to return after I become stronger. In the meantime, listen to Lord Kale and think hard about what I told you before. Your future depends on that. We need to become stronger now." Choi Han said to Kale, "Lord Kale, if you ever run into that darn wizard, please order the dragon to kill him right away. Don't let him to waste time like I did by going after his arm and not his head. In any case, if you run away after throwing a huge attack from the start, your chances of survive will increase, also." Kale looked at him and held his hand in front of Choi Han and said, "Enough chit-chat, just focus on not getting injured." Choi Han said with smile, "Yes, my lord. I won't get hurt." Kale turned and get in the carriage. On and Hong also followed him and closed the door. They looked at the carriage. Kale was sitting in the carriage with Dragon and looked at Han through the window and said, "Let's go." Han smiled. Kale looked out confusingly. Servants were standing there and the head said, "My lord, we pray for your safe return, we truly hope that we could see you again in the future. It was an honor serving you, my lord. We'll look forward to the day that we can meet again." Kale waved his hand. On and Hong also looked them from window. Kale put the curtains in the window and thought, "Don't say such awful thing, I don't plan on coming back to the capital ever again." Carriage started moving. On sniffed and said, "Something smells salty." On and Hong both looked out of the window. Hong asked, "Is this the sea?" Kale looked at them. He was holding a bowl in his hand and asked Dragon, "Is this the mana cohesion that was separated from the bomb?" Dragon said, "Yes, so we can make a new bomb out of this." Kale smiled. Hong said happily, "The cliffs are really amazing." Kale thought, divine cliffs are the most beautiful sights in the Uber state. One can see the islands beyond the whirlpools from these cliffs, but it is those whirlpools that make the waters at this estate so dangerous. The wizard slaughterer drifted off to one of those islands and stumbled upon the sound of the wind. There is a person stronger than Lark, a member of the Blue Wolf tribe and the future Wolf King. Thus, he is known to be the strongest person in the Western continent. He is the clever barbarian, the tyrant Tunka. If we are following the novel's storyline, then I still have some time before Tunka arrives here, I just have to get the power before the visit selector does. He blocked the mana bowl in box and kept it in his jacket inner pocket. He looked outside confusingly. On and Hong also looked this confusingly. Dragon squeezed on Kale back. Kale said worriedly, "Aren't those whales?" And thought, "There's no way, right? I am sure there are many ways heading north, those must just be normal bills passing by, right?" Dragon said, "I can feel strong power coming from them." Kale shivered and thought, why do bad feelings always point to the truth? The carriage stopped in the street and Han was standing near the door. Kale came out of the carriage. Han asked worriedly, "My lord, do you have motion sickness?" Kale replied, "No, I'm just anxious." Han pointed the coachman and said, "I do suppose the steep seaside cliffs can make one nervous, but our coachman is a veteran, so you don't need to worry at all." Kale glances at him. They both smiled. Kale looked them angrily. Amir came behind him and said, "Lord Kale." Kale turned and looked at her and said, "Long time no see, Lady Amir." She said, "Indeed." A guard came near to them and said, "My lady, the person we rescued has regained their senses." She asked surprisingly, "Really? Hold on." Kale thought confusingly, the person they rescued. Kale looked at Amir and thought, it can't be. She looked at Kale and said, "We rescued someone a few days ago while patrolling the coastlines, it seems that he has woken up." Kale thought, I'm getting a bad feeling. She said, when we saw him, he was passed out and was about to get sucked into the whirlpools, what to do? Then we remembered what you did at the plaza, Lord Kale. That's why we decided to rescue him. All lives are precious, right? Kale said, of course. She said, I knew you'd agree, Lord Kale. The man we rescued looked like someone from a clan in the Whipper Kingdom, at least from the way he was dressed and by his physique. Kale thought there's no doubt that is Tonka. The Wizard Alliance was opposed by the Non-Wizard Alliance. The leader of the Non-Wizard Alliance was from a clan that people in the Whipper Kingdom abhorred and called barbarians. But there are no barbarians in this world, everyone is born with the same brain. People just develop differently according to each of their history and customs. The clan did not use any magic and lived in the dangerous mountains and coastlines of the Whipper Kingdom. Instead, they focused on maximizing the natural physical strength of humans. They also sought to bring down the magician's hierarchy that molded the Whipper Kingdom, so that they could return it to the way it was in the beginning. Those from other nations could say that barbarians took over the kingdom, but they were just a bunch of free people. What it was is that the kingdom of reason was brought down by natural instinct. The only problem is that Tonka is really stupid. The clever barbarian? The novel describe him that way, but to me, he's just as simple and ignorant person. Who is all brawn no brain, and that is the scariest type of person there can be. There's no getting through to him, Amir said. Lord Kale Z, there's no need for you to worry about him, his recovery rate was alarmingly fast. Kale smiled and said, I'm not worried at all, I hope he receives treatment for a long time, and thought, that way, I don't have to run into him until I leave. Kale pressed his forehead and asked her, Lady Amir, could you show me to my room? She said, of course, you still need more rest, don't you? Kale said Z, yes, I'm afraid so. She turned and said, dear, right this way then. Kale followed her and thought, why is Tonka here right now? Also, I know Billos is with the Flynns and that he's competent, but how was he so sure that a civil war break out? How did he find out so soon? I didn't think much of what he said since I know he's skilled, but he is a bastard and there must be limits to what he can find out. So despite that, the fact that Billos knew only means one thing. The civil war is going to happen sooner than it did in the book, that would explain everything, but what could have changed the timeline? First of all, the fact that Tonka was found here. That alone has to mean his ship was destroyed by the wizard's attacks and he already possesses the power from the north, history doesn't change. Kale came in the house and closes the door. Servant said, allow me to guide you inside. Kale thought, peaceful but human power struck fear into the hearts of the wizards, he represented the pinnacle of the strength that human could achieve. The oceans, mountains, deserts, jungles, volcanic fields and the thunders in the north. Kale followed the servant and ascended the stairs and looked at the paintings on wall. He thought, Tonka was survived in all of these natural environments, wizards, who rely on mana, a natural power, could never win against someone like him, although a dragon could. Dragon looked at him and asked worriedly, what are you thinking about, human? Kale thought a dragon could kill Tonka with one attack. They came in the room. Dragon asked again, what is it, human? Kale said, don't leave my side for the time being, do not go anywhere. Dragon flapped and said, don't tell me what to do. Kale looked at him and thought, he says one thing and does another thing, this mansion doesn't suit the small seaside village it's in. The current Count Yubar built this place as she took the reins. That means the Emir's mother, the current Count Yubar, already has plans to develop the sea area as soon as she took control, and the fruit of her 10 years of hard work is slowly paying off. He opened the terrace door and came out and thought, dragging in the Gilberts and getting the assistances of the Whilsmans can't have taken a short amount of time. The Wind Cliffs, disc in front of it has been surrounded by whirlpools for centuries, and those whirlpools tormented the residents of the Uber state who wanted to venture out of the open sea, but there is a reason Count Uber valued this area. The village bordered a crescent coastline and had 2 cliffs in each of its sides, which makes it the only village out of 3 villages that was fit to dick ships. It also has numerous islands across the sea in front of the village, providing an exquisite view. That also makes it a good place for military base. I plan to venture out the smallest island there tomorrow morning. That's where I'll find the sound of the wind. It's a quiet but chaotic power, that's what Tonka called the power in the book. It's exactly the kind of power that I want. It can enable me to run away quietly and quickly while distracting my powerful enemies. He came in and sat on couch and thought with smile, I'm excited for tomorrow. In the night, Vikros with Lark's siblings came into the Kale room and the big one said, Uncle Vikros had made this seafood dish especially for you. He was really excited to see the sea. We hope you enjoy it, Lord Kale. Vikros served the food on table with the help of servant. He said, Here you go, my lord. Kale said, Okay, thank you. I'm glad I put you in the kitchen to help Vikros. He said, Thank you. Children ran towards the door. He also followed them and asked Vikros, Are you coming, uncle? Vikros looked at him with side eye and said, I'm coming. Kale stared eating. Vikros followed the servant and looked at Kale confusingly. Kale looked at him and thought, he makes a fine babysitter. Kale thought, when we got out of the carriage, a kid said, My lord, we'd like to work too. Lark told us we can't be freeloaders. The others nodded their heads. Kale looked at him and said, Then you can assist Vikros in the kitchen. He said, I think it'd be better if we help the knights, but we'll do our best either way. The others also said, We'll do our best. Kale said, You are all still kids, I cannot have you do dangerous things that the knights do, just help with Vikros chop vegetables and whatnot. He said, You really are just as Lark said, Yes. We'll work hard. Others also said loudly, We'll work hard. Then they helped Vikros in kitchen and also tease him for everything and Vikros take care them. Kale thought, he really makes the perfect babysitter. Vikros stared him while going out. Kale thought, wasn't he staring at me just now? And said, Thanks for always cooking me delicious meals. Vikros flinched and said, Yes, my lord. On and Hong came out under the couch. Kale said confusingly, Why is he trying to do his father's job? And thought, there's no need for Vikros to bring me my meal himself, but at some point he started taking over Ron's job one by one whenever he had the time. Thanks to that, I did not really feel like Ron was gone. He looked at Kitten and tapped the couch and said, Come and eat. They climbed in table. Dragon also fly from bed and sat on the table. At the bank of the sea, Kale was standing in front of a man. Amir was also standing there. Cake said to man, It's good to see you. The man replied, Same here's my lord. Just out your faith in me, I'll take you to the central island safely. Amir said, He's right. With him, you'll be able to go anywhere in the Yubar Sea. I should be the one to guide you, but something came up. Kale said, It's fine, my lady. It's enough that you found me a good ship and captain. Captain asked him, So will the three of you go together? Kale looked at them and replied, It seems so, let us go. Captain said, Yes, my lord, please board the ship. Kale went in the board through the board. Kale looked at Vikros and said, Vikros, I heard that many rare seafood get catch in the nets around the island. It will be good for you to learn about new ingredients. Vikros said bitterly, Thank you, my lord. On and Hong hugged Han tightly as afraid of water. Han laughed at their situation standing outside the boat. Han looked at Kale and said happily, I wish you safe travels. Kale looked at him and said, Thanks. Dragon was flying near the Kale and said, I'll fly there. Kale looked at him. Ship captain said, The ship will rock quite a bit, so make sure to grab into something and started moving the ship. Kale gripped in the box and say on it. He held his head and said, Darn it. Ship was moving in the water speedily and water was splashing. Captain laughed and said, My lord, aren't the whirlpools a sight if behold? Kale looked at him and thought, He's a very brave man. Lark brother sitting near the Kale grabbed his hand. Cake slapped on his hand and said, Let go if me. He started weeping. Captain said, My lord, that's the island, the whirlpool right in front of that island is the scariest one. Kale was feeling nauseous and thought, I feel like I'm going to be seasick. Captain said, We might really die if we get caught up in that. Ship was moving towards the island. Captain said to Kale, My lord, that's the island, the whirlpool right in front of that island is the scariest one. He looked at Kale and laughed and said, We might really die if we get caught up in that. Kale was looking not good. Captain said again, There are the legends that say those whirlpools appeared because of a thief who stole god item. Ship rattled. Captain controlled the ship and said, The ship J's almost flipped over. Lark brother was feeling nauseous. Captain looked the boy behind him and said, "Boy, you need row properly." He said, "I'm sorry father." Captain smiled and said, "As I was saying, my lord." Kale cut his talk and pressed his forehead and said, "Look, we can continue this talk after we get on that island." Captain laughed and said, "That's what Lady Amir said too, I'll take you there right away." Ship was moving from the near of whirlpools. Kale came out if the ship and Captain said, "We're here," that was a lot of easier than usual. Lark brother was vomiting badly. Kale and Vic Ross were looking at him and Kale thought, he could really die if that goes on. Vic Ross put in the gloves and went near to him. Kale looked at him and thought, are not those gloves he wears when he tortures someone to prevent himself from getting dirty? He looked at Captain and said, "Old man, I'm sure they'll be fine." Captain came near to him and said with smile, "Yes my lord." Kale said, "Continue the thief story from earlier." Captain said, "That, yes my lord. A long time ago, there was a thief with quickest feet in the world. The thief's feet were so light and careful that there was not a ripple or a single droplet of water when he ran on the surface of the sea. Anyways, one day that thief stole something that belonged to a god. He pointed a place and said, the thief took that, and you know the wind cliffs over there? Well, the thief jumped off from those cliffs with the item. That's how both the thief and the god's item disappeared from this world and those whirlpool came into existence. In the past, we used hold rituals for the god's item." Kale looked at him and asked, "Do you not do it anymore?" Captain replied, "If it were really the god's item, then why didn't the dog take it back but leave it here to torment us humans?" Kale nodded the head and thought, that's right. What he is told was not a god's items, but the human's power. That is why a goat can never own it, and said, "Then I'll take a look around the island now." Lark brother said, "My lord, let me," he was trembling. Vic Ross came near the Kale. Kale looked at him and said, "If you're the Ron Sin, that means you're probably not normal either." Vic Ross asked confusingly, "Meanings?" Kale said, "Hold him down here for me." Vic Ross looked at him and asked, "Will you be fine on your own?" Kale replied, "This place isn't dangerous at all and you know I have my shield." Vic Ross said, "I hope you return safely, my lord." Kale said, "I'll be right back." Vic Ross out hand on Lark brother's shoulder and said, "Please shoot the shield into the sky if you're in danger." Lark brother was constantly vomiting and said, "My lord, I'll be right behind." Kale looked at them and thought with smile, I still need to have someone stay beside me for the time being. Someone who's strong but without a major sense of duty to protect me and someone I can order around, and Vic Ross ticks all the boxes. That's why I brought him here with me. He was walking between the trees and thought, I don't need to go in too deep, I just dropped by here to check out the whirlpools, but I still need to check the terrains since I am going to fly here at night. He looked at a tree and asked, "How is it?" Black Dragon was sitting in the branch of the tree and replied, "It's just like you said, human. There's something underneath the whirlpools here." He tapped the Kale's shoulder and said, "It felt similar to the power we found in cave." Kale raised his hand and asked, "There's no one here, right?" He replied, "No, there's isn't, but there is a corpse." Kale stopped and said shockingly, "What?" Dragon said, "When I looked down at the island from the sky, there were 3 dead bodies on the opposite coast of where you landed." Kale thought, corpses? I have a bad feeling that something is going to happen if I go on. Dragon looked at him and said, "What are you doing, human?" Dragon said again, "But those corpses weren't human." Kale thought worriedly, "So they look human but aren't, there's only one answer." Kale looked at Dragon and asked, "Did their hands and feet look strange?" Dragon replied, "You're right, the hands and feet did look strange, they looked like fans." Kale thought, that is a characteristic of mere people. First the whale and now the mere people, it isn't time for the whales and mere people to appear yet. Kale thought worriedly, whales and mere people? It's not yet time for them to appear. Actually, no, the war between the whale tribe and mere people has a history far longer than that of any human conflict, but it only appeared in the novel after Choi Han had gotten mixed up with the hill whale tribe. Kale called Dragon, "Hey." Dragon said angrily, "Don't call me hey." Kale looked at him and asked, "Then what do I call you?" He replied, "You'll figure that out soon enough." Kale looked at him confusingly and thought, what is it talking about? He started walking and asked, "There's no one up ahead?" Dragon replied, no one alive, and same goes for underwater. Kale looked at him and said, then guide me, and thought, I will have to take a look at the mere people crops, but I don't want to be in danger, so. He looked at Dragon and said with smile, you lead the way. Kale and Dragon was standing on the bank of the sea and looked the mere people corpses laying with the rock. Kale looked at them and said shockingly, it's real. Dragon looked at him and asked, why aren't you going closer? Kale replied, it's scary. Dragon said, I forgot, weak human. Dragon came near the corpses and said, they looked like they were crushed to death and not too long ago at that. Also, I see traces of red blood under their webbed feet, I think it's from a fight they had. Kale looked at them and thought, I am sure that a whale killed these mere people. Whale tribe has about as few members as the dragons, but they are the strongest beings in the sea. That's how they could protect these sea world from the mere people. The mere people wanted to build their own kingdom in sea, and the whale tribe would not allow anyone to divide the sea into territories. This was because moving around is a trait of all marine species. The whale tribe is few in numbers, but they have been strong enough to suppress the mere people until now. However, the mere people suddenly start to get stronger. That's why the whale tribe found itself in a difficult situation, and right around then is when Choi Han appears and joins their side. That's where Book 5 of The Birth of a Hero ends. Kale looked at Dragon and said, let's go back. Dragon flayed near towards him and looked at him and asked, can we just leave them there? Kale replied, yeah, and thought, the whales left them out there on purpose. The mere people corpses out on land will dry out but not rot. When it rots in water, these smells spreads and the other mere people will find and collect the bodies. Those mere people were probably killed by a single member of the whale tribe. If there were more than one, they did have used those corpses to lure and kill more mere people. I should take care of things here quickly and leave. He came back to them. Vikros was holding a fish. Kale looked at him and said, let's go back, there's nothing to see here. In the night, at the Kale room, a box was opened and Kale looked at On and Hong and said, make sure you watch the house properly. They said, we won't let anyone in, take care. Kale sat on the wall of the terrace and looked at them and said with smile, okay. Dragon said, flight. Kale jumped and said, let's go. They saw the Yubar estate from the sky and Kale thought, maybe it's because it's by the village, but it sure is farm here at night. He looked at water and said, those look worse at night, and thought, that Tunka really is insane. Tunka enjoyed dangerous things, no, he obsessed with them. I have never been to the sea before, but this looks fun. That's the last said before he hurled himself into those whirlpools. Of course, I don't intend on doing that. Dragon looked at Kale and asked, is this the place? Kale looked at him and said, let's begin. Dragon said, okay human. Kale opened the bag and took out the mana ball he collected from the magic bomb. Dragon released energy. Kale looked at the ball and thought, this is not the same mana bomb used by the secret organization in the first 2 books of The Birth of Your Hero, it's a stronger mana bomb than that. This is similar to the mana bomb developed by the Wizard Alliance of the Whipper Kingdom when they were on the brink of total annihilation in the latter part of Book 3. The main ingredient, which is mana coagulation, reacts to the maker's mana and breaks off into multiple parts before exploding. The power it has decreases, but it was a better weapon because it exploded multiple times. Kale looked at Dragon and said, you're amazing for making things. Dragon said with pride, that's right, I'm a great and proud dragon. Be careful, don't get hurt. Kale looked at him and then looked down and dropped the mana ball. The bomb exploded and water splashed and hit the Kale protective circle. Kale opened his eyes, he was wearing glasses and came underwater. He stood in the ground and looked around and thought, Tunka, you crazy bastard. He looked a rock and thought, he managed to break this rock. Kale looked at top moving. A voice came from top, those bastards. How is me stealing what they made by sacrificing people a crime? I was going to give it back to the people, they are just trash. Why are they the ones to hold the power? Kale thought, the legendary thief that supposedly stole a god's item, did not actually steal a god's belonging, but she did steal from a temple. She was drowned to death by having her feet tied down to this huge boulder, that was the only way to kill the thief with the fastest and most silent feet. She was wind itself, and so, after her death, she became a top and kept gushing out gusts. Voice came again, the water is nothing, my friend. The light can burn it all. Kale opened the bag and thought, light? Voice came, do you know why lightings are scary? It's because they come with the bomb, a bomb. The unbreakable shield and tree, the energy of the heart and wind, the sound of the wind and water, and the last powerful retrieve by passing through a ball of flame is the fire of destruction. And Kale thought worriedly, should I just leave this top here? He looked watch on his hand and thought, I have just 3 minutes left. He raised an excavator and thought, I will think more about this later, let's just stick that out for now. Kale sat and started digging and thought, there's no need to break this rock open like that idiot Tonka did, I will just need to dig the ocean floor. Voice came from top, if stealing was my crime, then how come they claim to be innocent after laying to all the peoples? This world is rotten, it's sort of turn world where only the rich keep getting richer. Kale picked the top and thought yes, the world was always rotten. The soul of the sound of the wind only want one thing, and that is liberation through the destruction. He put the top under his feet and crushed it. The top got broken and voice came, you're someone who resurrects others. Kale listened him and thought, someone who resurrects? Is he talking about the energy of the heart? Water started moving fastly, voice came, make sure you don't get caught like I did, be free. A lot of pressure was putted in his heart. He out hand in heart and thought shockingly, what is this? His feet get lifted from ground. The wind stopped and he stood on ground and thought, no way. Did the energy of the heart also enhance the sound of the wind? He looked at watch and thought, should head back up soon. He looked up and jumped, he thought, the other whirlpools should also disappear in about a week. He came out if the water and exhaled. He was floated on the water and said, I need to hurry back. And thought, I have told Hans not to come wake me up unless my life depended on it, so he won't enter my room easily, but still, it did be best to hurry back. Kale was floated on the water and looked a place and thought, found it. He started swimming towards the place and thought, after Tonka had found the sound of the wind. He happened to came across something interesting here. Kale came out of the water and stood in front of a cave and thought, it wasn't much use to Tonka, but this is an important ingredient that I can use. When this ingredient meets with the ingredient that Lark will bring me later, the Jungle Queen will have no choice but to make a deal with me. Kale sat down and thought happily, after all the Queen needs to save her jungle, he should be here soon. Dragon asked Kale, weak human, you're not hurt. Kale looked at him. He pointed a thing and said, there is something alive in that cave. It's almost dead but it's not yet a corpse, which you fear so much. Kale stood up and thought, so that's why you're using telepathy. Should I just dive back into the water? Or maybe I should ask the dragon to take me home. A hand tapped the ground and said, save me. Kale listened this shockingly. A man was dragging himself back and said, there's something that I have to do, I can't die here, please. There were the wounds on his arm and red and green blood was coming. Kale looked at him and thought, he's a whale. Dragon looked at Kale and said, weak human, did you catch a cold? You look pale. Kale looked at Whale Man and thought, should I make a run for it, but a whale man hurt be mere people poison? He's a half-blood, in the birth of a hero. The whale tribe were few in numbers just like the rare dragons were, and there were no half-bloods among them, but the book said there was a dead half-blood. Dragon looked at Kale and asked, human, are you going to just leave him like that? Hyun went near the whale man and sat down. Kale looked at him and said, hey. Whale man said, save. Kale said, alright, I'll save you. Though, my predictions are right, staying alive might prove to be even more painful for you. You're a purebred wolfman. Lark said, what about it? He said, my child isn't a purebred. Lark said, but I thought Watira is a purebred. He said, not her, Jay used to have a son too, he was a half-blood. So, he had a pretty tough time. Lark asked, then does he live out in land? He replied, no. That little jerk decided that he was going to leave this world. Kale looked at Whaleman and said, you should sleep for a while, everything will be better after you wake up. Whaleman looked at him and closed his eyes. Kale looked at Dragon and said, how is he? He's a mess. Kale looked at his wounds and thought, the whale tribe skin is supposed to be thick and tough, but it appears the poison got underneath the skin when he got attacked. Dragon looked at him confusingly and said, you really are a strange human. Not only are you weak but you are also weird. Kale looked at Whaleman and said, "Z enough gibberish, put him in water." Dragon looked at him confusingly and asked angrily, "You were lying? You said you did save him, human. You are weak, but at least you always kept your word." Kale stared Whaleman. Dragon shouted angrily, "But you want me to put him in water? You want to drown him?" Kale exhaled and said, "I'm doing this to save him. After you dip him in water, remember the corpses that we saw today?" Dragon asked, "Just what are you trying to make me do?" He smiled and said, "Nothing, just bring me one arm from the corpses." Dragon looked at him shockingly and flayed and said, "All right, I'll do it." Kale looked at him and thought, "I should get moving now too." He walked and came near the water and stopped. He looked the water and thought, "I finally found it, the special small pond that Tunka found." He opened the bag and took out a bottle. He filled bottle with that water and thought, "This is the water that subdues fire. If I can put the item that Lark brings me in this water to make the item on water type, our relief precious item will be created. It will be the treasure will save the jungle from a drought." Dragon was sitting near the Whaleman and brought the arm Kale asked him. He heard footsteps and looked at their side. Kale came near to them and said with smile, "Let's go." Kale entered the room through terrace and On and Hong jumped and hugged him. They said, "You're on right time, the butlers just started banging on the door." He looked at the door and heard Han's voice. Hans was knocking the door and saying, "My lord, you said you'd kill me if I went in to wake you up, so please excuse my rudeness for knocking on your door instead." Kale was taking off the wet clothes. Hans said again, "My lord, would you please open this door?" Kale threw a badge towards Dragon and said, "Use this invisibility badge to hide that Whaleman." Hans said again, "My lord." Kale put on the sleeping gown and went near the door. Hans constantly saying that, "My lord, Lady Amir has asked me check that you are safe, so please wake up and open." Kale opened the door. Hans was again trying to knock the door and swing. He looked at Kale. Kale looked at him and asked, "What is it?" Hans came in and asked him confusingly, "My lord, were you washing up?" Kale replied, "I could not sleep, so I was soaking myself in the sea-water hot tub." Hans said with smile, "You are in the bathroom, so you were not sleeping, which means I don't have to die." Kale said, "Do you think so?" Hans bowed and said, "I apologize, my lord." Kale looked at him and said, "Good." Hans coughed and said, "You're not hurt anywhere, are you?" "Right now, it's chaotic out there." Kale looked outside. Hans said, "Something must have happened at sea, after the loud explosion sounds from earlier. I did hear something loud but no one knows what's going on for sure yet. Lady Amir said that she did go out to sea to check, I think we will hear something soon." Kale looked outside and thought, "I'm sure Amir would be thrilled." He turned and looked at Hand and asked, "Really?" Hans nodded and said, "Yes my lord." Kale said, "All right, you may go now." Hans bowed and said, "Yes my lord." He left the room and closed the door. Dragon was laying on the couch and the Whaleman was laying down near to him and the Hand of Mere People was also present near to him. Kale poured water in the tub and came near the Whaleman. On and Hong was looking at Whaleman and trembling. Kale stopped near the Whaleman and put the tab in ground and held the Mere People arm. Dragon was looking him confusingly. Kale threw the arm in the tub. He took out the arm front water tub and thought, "Done. If it expands any more, it will rot, this is perfect." Whaleman turned his head. Dragon looked at him and said, "Human, I think he's about to wake up. Human, remove your knife." Whaleman opened his eyes. Kale was holding a knife in his hands. He smiled and stabbed the knife in Mere People arm. Whaleman was confused. Kale smiled and said, "All done." He held Mere People arm where blood was coming in front of Whaleman and said, "Now, drink this before it rots, this blood will cure you." And thought, in the 5th book of The Birth of a Hero, Lark got hurt when he threw himself at the Mere People without any prior knowledge and this was the cure that Rosalind discovered while trying to save Lark. The cure is not known to the world yet. Whaleman looked at the blood and drank it and he feel himself better. He asked Kale shockingly, "How?" Kale smiled and asked, "Aren't you the one behind this arm and the corpses?" Kale put the hand in the water again and said, "If you're a whale, you have to be back in the sea by sunrise at the latest to regain your strength." Whaleman listened him shockingly. Kale stood up and said, "You can sleep here then leave by yourself later." Whaleman glared at him and asked, "Did you know I was a whale?" Kale turned his head and looked at him and said, "3 more people are dead. The arm got mixed with water." Kale asked him, "Who else could have done that?" In the Kale room, Kale was standing and Whaleman was sitting in the ground. Kale said, "I have to go back home, I am not interested in your silly story. You asked me to save you, and so I did, that is all." Whaleman looked at him confusingly. Kale sat on his bed and said, "I am going to bed, you can see yourself out quietly." He lay down on the bed and thought, "The dragon is here so nothing should happen to me. Kim Roksu lost his family in real life and so I, Kim Roksu, decided to meddle just this once." The king of Whale tribe said, "I do not want to lose another family member ever again. If he were still alive and I had given the throne to my daughter and lived on in the human world with him, maybe that would have made my son happy." Lark said, "Watira does seem like she'll make a fine queen by she has a big heart, so don't you think she'd want to live with you too?" King said, "Probably, when my son disappeared, she turned the entire ocean upside down looking for him." Lark said, "I bet she really did turn the ocean upside down with her size and power. Can you tell me what your son's name is?" King said, "Paiton, that's my son name." In the Kale room, Paiton was standing near to Kale bed. Next morning, Kale wake up and stretched his arms. On and Hong was sitting near to him. On told him that, he said he'll come back tonight. Kale said, "But he doesn't have to." In the street Kale was standing, Amir walked towards him and said, "Lord Kale, I came as fast as I could to tell you an amazing piece of news, can you guess what it is?" Kale said, "I have no idea what it could be." She said surprisingly, "The whirlpool, the giant whirlpool in front of the central island has vanished, it disappeared overnight without a trace." Kale looked at back of the Tunka and thought, "Yes, I did that." Tunka said, "What a shame. I wanted to dive into that whirlpool just one time, should I dive into a different one instead?" Kale listened him and thought, Tunka really is nuts. Amir called him. Kale looked at her. She said, "Since the Henitus is one of our investors, I'd like to show you the site of the peaceful coastline of Yubar. Will you come with me to the central island?" Kale looked at her and asked, "Is everyone here going with us?" She replied, "Yes." Tunka came near to them. Amir looked at him and said, "You two have never met, right?" She pointed Kale and said, "He is the man who was almost swept up by the whirlpools the other day. Mr. Bob Z. This is Lord Kale Henitus." Kale thought confusingly, "Bob?" Bob smiled and said, "It's a pleasure to meet you, my name's Bob." Kale looked at him shockingly and thought, what a fitting alias he came up with. Amir said, "Bob is from the Whipper Kingdom, he is a tribesman from a small village near the coast but he somehow got stranded out on sea after sailing out to fish on his boat." Bib said with smile, "Yes, I caught small fish and live a quiet and peaceful life, I don't know how this even happened to me." Kale listened to him and thought angrily, "Quiet and peaceful life, my butt." Amir said with smile, "He helped us with our search last night in the ship." Man standing away from them looked angry. Kale looked at them and thought, "I see that. Unlike Amir, some of them don't like him much, is it because he's a tribesman?" Bob looked at Kale and said, "I heard that you protected people in the capital with your shield, I asked Lady Amir to bring me here so I could meet these strong and young shield lord myself." Hyun looked at him confusingly and thought, "This is dangerous," and said, "That's exactly why I'm taking a long rest." Bob asked, "A long rest?" Kale said, "Yes, the shield isn't a strong power." Amir said, "That, right. He used too much of his power, so he's now resting and traveling." Bob looked at Kale and asked, "Is that so?" They glanced each other. Bob lost his interest and turned his head. Kale looked at him and thought, "Yes, that's more like Tunka. Sacrifice oneself for others? Being a hero? This guy doesn't care about such things one bit. Strength, that's the only thing he's obsessed with. He will ignore the weak, even they are his allies, and from time to time, he did even kill the weak. That's what made him a tyrant." Amir asked them, "Shall we go now?" They all walked towards the boat. Captain looked at them and said, "We're ready to set sail, everyone, please board the ship." They get on the ship. Tunka said, "That's strange, I smell something strong nearby." Kale looked at Dragon and thought, "As I thought, he's sharp." Dragon said, I don't smell at all. Kale looked at Tonka and thought, does this mean Tonka's intuit is stronger than that of a beast man? I need to act weaker than usual. Boat was moving in the water. Amir and Kale were standing near to each other and Amir said, we're currently looking into how the whirlpools suddenly just disappeared. My father and the sorcerers in my fief will join us in this investigation. Kale said, is that so? That's a relief. I hope you will be able to soon find out why this happened. Dragon said, you're a good lair. Kale said, I also hope that the other whirlpools disappear soon too. Dragon said again, you're laying again. Human did not use say the other whirlpools remain for another year? Amir turned his head towards him and said, yes. We will discover the reason and use it to get rid of other whirlpools too. Since we've received help from many people and acquired this opportunity, we will have to make the best of it. Kale thought, I kind of feel sorry now and said, I'm sure you and the Yubars can make that happen. Amir said, thank you, your words are reassuring. Kale asked with smile, I feel a bit dizzy from the sunlight, would it be okay for me to rest a while in the shade? Amir said, yes of course. Tonka was watching them. Amir said, you should be testing so please do not work too hard. Kale said, all right then. Boat stopped on the island and tied with a rock. Amir was giving instructions to the guards. Kale was walking between the trees. Dragon looked at him and said, are not you scared of the corpses there? You get scared easily. Kale said, it's fine. Kale stopped at the spot where he saw the corpses of the mere people but it was empty. Kale said shockingly, what the? Dragon said, it wasn't me, I didn't do anything. Kale thought, did Paitan do this? If I did not know that there were corpses here before, I did have just thought these were crumbs on the boulders. He touched the rock and said, how did the dead mere people? He pressed the rock and felt something strange. He turned and looked at sea, water was splashing. Dragon said, something's coming up from under the ocean and really fast too. A whale was moving under the water, he came out of the water. Kale looked at it confusingly. Whale stopped in the bank and looked at Kale. Dragon said angrily, is that thing crazy? How dare you look at my weak human with those eyes? Whale tapped the water. Kale put his hand on chest and thought, that's definitely a whale beast man. Shield came out of his heart and protect him. Whale said, I'm not here to fight. Dragon asked angrily, then why are you raising your head? Clearly, you've been trying to pick a fight, you puny whale. Kale raised his hand and patted Dragon head and said, don't be mad, you could get hurt. Dragon said angrily, I don't get hurt, I'm strong. Kale calmed down him and said, I know but you should still be careful. Dragon said, weak human, you be careful yourself. Kale turned his head to Whale. Dragon stared Whale. Whale said, let me ask. A voice came from his behind, Watira, you can't chew him to death. She turned and looked back confusingly. A whale was moving towards them speedily. She twirled and said, Paitan. Water splashed and hit Kale. Dragon asked him worriedly, human, are you alright? Kale cleaned his face and thought, forget it, anyway. He looked Watira's scar and thought, that scar in its back, I knew it, so that's the humpback whale.